We have a lot of slides. A lot of the stuff that's at the end of the program definitely builds on other classes that you will have, insect control, plant problem diagnosis. So if we don't get to all of that, it's going to pop up in other places. I'm sure Scott's told you that this program's sort of layered on each other, and you'll hear things, that touch on other classes all the time. So I do have a lot of slides. I sent the handout, and he didn't end up printing it. So if you have any questions or I'm going too fast, just let me know. I will go ahead and send around what we.
Yeah, tonight is the one night I did not find my notebook for paper. I owe you.
These are just some sort of random handouts. The book, once you get the book, has a lot of good information also.
I have an extra, a friend that
Sure.
will be getting here late.
Didn't give you an extra, did I?
That's when I remember I go put it on the website.
I have one for my sister too. She's
Sure.
on vacation. My daughter's working tonight.
We just started our Master Gardener class also last Wednesday. They'll have their second class.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm taking the native plants class in
Brown County?
Brown
Uh-huh.
County. Yeah, the last one's tomorrow.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so this looks familiar.
Yeah. Well, if you don't need it, I'll keep it because I'm actually down to very few. So if they gave you one.
I think so, I'll just use it
Okay.
tonight. Actually,
Yeah, we'll talk about it a little bit tonight, but not about the specific information in there. So what we're going to cover tonight, you guys have not had your plant science class. So normally this would be a little bit of plant science review. This will just be a little touch on plant science, and you'll get more detail when you have your plant science class. We are going to talk a little bit about design, not really overall landscape design, but we're going to talk about some ideas that you can use when you're designing your actual flower beds around your home. And I believe Steve's class will focus more on the overall design, hardscape, all those kind of things. We'll talk about how to care for plants so that they look good. We'll talk about some options that you might use for your garden. We could talk about lists of plants forever and ever and ever, but these are just some I picked out. I am sort of a native plant person, so a lot of what I touch on are native plants. And then as we have time, we'll talk about different problems you might run into in the garden and how you might solve those. And how far we get sort of depends on you guys and how much discussion we want to have and that kind of thing. And I do appreciate questions. I appreciate discussion. I like it to be a little more interactive. If it's not, I feel like I'm boring you to death. So real quick, when you think of an herbaceous plant, what do you think of?
Not a tree.
Something that's not woody. So what does it do in the winter? Dies back to the ground, yep. So you don't really have anything left over. Sometimes you have no evidence at all that it even exists. So we can think of it as plants whose above ground parts are annual, dies to the ground in the winter. Sometimes, like in this case, you can see this sedum here. You might have some little evergreen leaves that overwinter, but you're not going to have the full plant overwintering. Sometimes the buds are at ground level. Sometimes you don't, like I said, you don't see anything, and you'll see them, they're below ground level. They grow by producing more buds, so their clumps get bigger over time. And they can take time, if they're perennials, to reach maturity where they're actually producing flower and fruit. They may take a couple seasons to actually reach that. We'll talk a little bit more about that. They spread by things like seeds, both annuals and perennials can be big seed producers, reproduced by seed. They can spread by stolons, which in this case, this is a strawberry plant. It's above ground stem. Or they can spread by rhizomes, which can either be, some plants like their rhizomes to be very near the surface, some like them to be a relatively significant distance underground. This is a dahlia, and you can see the rhizome there. So we'll just talk about a few definitions. Like I said, you'll get more of these in plant science, and this is just to make sure we're sort of all on the same page as we talk. So an annual can have a couple different definitions. The botanical definition of an annual is a plant that completes its life cycle from seed to growing, producing flowers, fruit, and seed in one 12-month period. So that's the botanical definition. And there's some examples: annual sunflower, zinnia, cleome. But horticulturally, we can treat them a little differently. Sometimes we grow things that are really tropical plants, but here we treat them like annuals. Sometimes they are true botanical annuals. Sometimes they're a perennial that, if it were grown in Georgia, would overwinter and survive. But here they're not hardy enough, and so we treat them as an annual here. And here's some examples. Petunia, we treat as an annual here. It would actually be perennial. Biennials live for 2 years. They grow their first year, typically a basal rosette, so a rosette of leaves that are very close to the ground. The next year, that rosette will come up. They'll produce more foliage and then send up a flower spike, produce fruit and seed. You can adjust sometimes biennials depending on whether Mother Nature cooperates and if you line things up correctly. If you get them started early enough, you may be able to force flowering the first year. Or if you're quick enough on the deadheading that it doesn't feel like it's gone through its complete cycle, you can get additional years of flowering. Not something you should necessarily plan on being able to do all the time, but you can manipulate them a little bit. And there's some examples there as well. Perennials live 3 or more years. You can bet on what time they're going to flower. Peonies are going to flower around Mother's Day typically. Iris, maybe the end of May, beginning of June, that kind of thing. If you start them from seed, they can take quite a while to produce. This says may not flower until the 2nd year. They can actually take longer than that. Something like tulips, if you tried to grow tulips from seed, you're waiting at least 5 years, maybe more, before you actually produce any flowers. And then perennials, we also assign a zone to them. Just like I mentioned, they're not all hardy everywhere, so they're only perennial in certain parts of the country. So that zone will tell you whether they grow as perennials there. Any questions about the life cycles as we're talking about plants? Like I said, you'll get much more detail on this in your plant science class. Okay.
Rhizome and stolen, is that you said?
Stolen.
Another class, you think?
Yes, they'll cover that in plant science. They'll talk about the different structures, root systems, all that kind of stuff. Yep. It also should be in your book under the plant science section. Do you all have books except for you? Okay, good. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about design, but not necessarily design around your whole home. More about design and picking your flowers for your flower beds and things to think about as you're doing that. So some of the things you do need to think about are the aesthetics, such as flower color and foliage color. As you guys know, you're already probably pretty avid gardeners. The varieties that are available, you know, it gets broader and broader every year, the foliage colors and options that are out there. So thinking about how those things go together, and we'll see some examples. How things adapt to the environment, whether they're tolerant of full sun or part sun, whether they tolerate well-drained soils or poorly drained soils. Some plants are particularly good at thriving in low fertility soils. For example, herbs in general do pretty well under low fertility conditions. Whether they can tolerate heat better than some. A stilby, if you grow a stilby and you've got it in a particularly warm spot, it'll usually look a little exhausted by the end of the day and may need watering more than other things just because of the high temperatures. And then some other things to think about, and we'll talk about more about, is bad habits that you want to avoid, and think of them as you're designing your landscape beds so that you can avoid more labor in the future. In order to be successful, you guys will probably hear this a whole lot if you haven't heard it already, putting the right plant in the right place is key. Some things to think about are drainage. Do you have good drainage or poor drainage? There are plants that will fit in pretty much any kind of drainage situation. They didn't print my other handout. So another handout that I emailed a link to, and I will remind Scott to either send you guys the link or print it for you, is the Indiana Native Plant and Wildflower Society has a landscaping with native plants brochure. It's a PDF. You guys can Google it online also. It lists plants that, like on wetland edges or dry shade, it categorizes native plants that are commonly available in nursery trade and where they can fit in the landscape. So it's a pretty handy thing to have if you're interested in native plants. And they should have printed it, but that's okay. We'll get it into your hands one way or another. So do all of you have spots like this in your yard where you've got ponding water? And what do you do with those spots currently?
It's just grass.
Grass. Yeah. My ponded spot is lawn also. I've thought several times about putting in a rain garden in that area, which would help soak up the moisture and, would incorporate more native plants into my landscape, which would be a good thing for butterflies and birds, which I want to attract to my yard. But if you perhaps move to a new area or you're trying to help a neighbor and you've never been around to see where water ponds on their property, there are actually a couple little tests you can do to determine whether your soil is well drained or poorly drained. Here's one example. Just dig a hole 18 inches deep. You want to do it when you haven't had 7 inches of rain the day before. You want to do it when you've had sort of, normal precipitation. Dig a hole 18 inches deep. Fill it with water. If it is pretty much drained after an hour, you've got good drainage. If it's still mostly full after an hour, you've got poor drainage. Simple test, but it works. And then there's another little more complicated method, but it ends up giving you about the same results. But if you're the kind of analytical person that likes a little more detail in your processes, this one might be the one for you. You dig a hole a foot deep, you refill the hole with water, and you measure the depth of the water. And then over time, after 15 minutes, you just decide how much water has drained away. If you're draining less than 4 inches per hour, you've got wet or poorly drained soils. If you're draining greater than 8 inches an hour, you've got well-drained soils bordering on dry soils. So 2 tests you can take, especially if, like I said, if you're unfamiliar with the property or you're trying to help somebody as a master gardener do their landscaping and you want to have a better understanding of their drainage situation. Those are a couple things you can do. So fixing drainage can be pretty expensive and labor intensive and often still is not super successful. putting in French drain or tile, and then the tile gets clogged, or the French drain isn't angled exactly right, so the water doesn't run off as much as you hoped. So fixing drainage, people do it. It can be done, but there are also plants that will fit into any of those drainage regimes. So instead of sort of battling the conditions, you might think about how you can work with the conditions that you've been given. Any questions on drainage or measuring drainage? Or, like I mentioned, that IMPAWS, Indiana Native Plant and Wildflower Society publication that we'll get it to you has good information on what can really tolerate poorly drained soils or even wet soils. So.
You said something about a rain garden. What's that?
So a rain garden is basically an area where water may drain to, and you actually want it to drain to that area, and it's an area where you can amend the soil with compost so that it soaks up the water, and then plant it with native plants. So they're growing there, they're attracting pollinators, all that kind of stuff. A lot of people, or a lot of municipalities, have instituted rain garden programs, because it also helps clean stormwater rather than people just having water run directly off their lawn or off their roof. They hold the water on site. Fewer contaminants move into the water and then are picked up as they roll down the street, kind of thing. University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point has a nice rain garden how-to kind of thing. There's lots of information out there on rain gardens these days. All right, determining whether your plants are, or your area where you want to put your flower garden is sunshade or somewhere in between. Here are some general guidelines, although there are lots of definitions and gray areas. Full sun is at least 6 hours of direct sunlight per day. Part shade is 4 to 5 hours of sun, but it's usually dappled light, not direct, blazing sun bearing down on something all day. And then shade would really be just no direct sunlight, maybe, a dabble or two of sunshine hits it as the wind blows, but in general it does not get direct sun at all. Other things that calculate into that are not just, how many hours of sunlight it gets a day, but, is that a spot that drains really well? So not only is it hot, but it also gets dry quickly. Or is it a spot where, like we'll say, you might be considering putting in a flower bed next to a concrete retaining wall. So you have perhaps a full sun area, but not only do you have full sun, you're going to have reflected heat off the concrete at the end of the day. So you need to think about those things. It's not just the hours of sun, but it's also how protected are they from the wind. Some plants are particularly susceptible to desiccation by the wind. So do they have some wind protection there, or are they exposed to the wind? All those kind of things help you put thinking about all those kind of things help you put the right plant in the right place. And even if you put a good plant in the wrong place, usually if you're an observant gardener and willing to make some moves with your plants, you can give it a try in one place, and then if it's not working, move it, and it should still survive. So if you put a sun-loving plant in a shady area, usually what it's going to do is reach for the light. You can tell it'll be leggy and thin and reaching for the light. It won't produce a flower. We get lots of questions on why isn't my X flowering, and a lot of times it's not under the right light conditions. It can potentially die if the sunlight is that limited, but hopefully, like I said, you'll be an observant gardener and perhaps move it before then. If you put a sun-loving plant in part sun, it will look healthy and relatively vigorous, but again, you're unlikely to probably get blooms in that case. Or it's not particularly vigorous. It just looks a little weak. And if you put a sun-loving plant in a nice sunny spot, it's going to do well. Some other things that you can try, I talked about the reflected heat. Typically, that's off south or west sides of buildings. So if you have, say, for example, you want to put some full sun plants out around your home, but you only have 4 to 5 hours of sunlight rather than 6 plus. Putting them on the south or west side of your house is going to give them some extra heat. It might boost them into that category where they feel they're happy there and vigorous. Same goes for shadier plants that like shady areas. Even if the north and east side of your house get full sun, it's likely to be less intense than it would be on the south and west. So you can try plants that might like part sun on the north side or east side because the intensity is going to be less. You can play with the zones a little bit, just in response to, plants that like it really warm and might grow in part shade further south might tolerate full sun up here. And the same kind of thing with if you're moving plants from the north. If they tolerated conditions up north, they might do well in more shade in the warmer climates. So you can play around with things a little bit. Lots of gray areas in the sunlight category just because so many other factors fall into the microclimate and how that impacts plants. Does anybody have any examples of around their house where they've tried things or moved things or?
I used to live in a house that had a separate garage about 12 feet away from the house. And anything I planted between those two buildings cooked because it was a brick house and a brick garage.
Right.
So,
Could never really find anything that would do well there.
Peonies did well there, believe it or not, but.
Yeah, it was a hard site to adapt to. Yeah, and I have a flower farmer that I work with down in Monroe County, and she can grow things up against the side of her hoop house that normally would not be hardy in our winters, but because they get heat from that building, they're hardy through all but the most severe winters. So microclimate definitely makes a big impact on, and that's something you really only learn by living in the spot and trying to garden there. Right. There is no perfect formula for figuring that out at all. So that's why I always encourage people to experiment.
Clematis loved it there.
Oh, interesting.
Crazy.
Yeah, well,
It
so,
wasn't close to either brick wall.
yeah. So that's one thing that I like people to walk away from this class feeling like they can move plants. Try it in one spot, it doesn't work, dig it up and move it.
When I built a new house, I moved a lot of plants and took them with
Yeah.
me. In fact, I have peonies I took from my in-laws to the first house to the second house. So they're in their third location.
Yeah. Yeah, and even within sight, if within your property, if things aren't working, just feel like you can move it, have the confidence to move them. So the same goes with the soil moisture. Sun plants may tolerate sunnier spots or shadier spots. Sunnier spots if they have plenty of moisture available. Full sun plants that like wet soils can tolerate more shade if the soils are drier. So just more playing around, more figuring out your site and the specific conditions around there. So what happens if you get you've planted something and it's in the wrong place? We talked about this a little bit already. You won't get any flowering, or you'll get minimal flowering. There are other things that can cause no flowers or fruit to form. Things like too much nitrogen can be a cause of that. The plant's not mature enough to reproduce yet. The late freeze or frost may take off the blooms, that kind of thing. So if something doesn't flower and produce fruit, that may not be the immediate reason to think, oh, I've got to move it. You need to think about what else was going on. Leaning toward the light, just lacking vigor, being thin and sparse. With grasses, they may sort of stretch for the light and flop over. They will also do that. They'll also flop over if they've got too much water in general. So, but those are things to look for. And like I said, feel like you can move your plants around. Too much sun, you'll also get bleaching, as you can see on the hosta. We've all probably seen burned up hosta leaves that actually look much worse than this one. Too much sun could also cause scorch, where you actually have dead leaf tissue around the edges. Often that can be a indication that your plant is in too sunny a spot, but it also can be an indication that the root system may not be developed enough, or it's just been hot, dry, and windy, and it's desiccating the plant as the wind blows through there. So scorch may or may not be an indication that you're in too much sun. It may be an indication that you just got some other kind of plant stress going on. So more things to think about as you're trying to populate your flower beds. The size of the plant with and without flowers, and the mature size of the plant. We can fill up our flower beds with lots of little things, and then it's overcrowded, which one will not be as aesthetically pleasing, but also more likely to encounter disease and insect problems when plants are really packed in there. Leaf color and texture, when they flower, what the form of the flower is it a spike or a ball? How do those things go together? Do they have a fragrance? And if they do have a fragrance, is it planted in a spot that you'll actually be able to enjoy it? Or is it way out at the front of the yard, which you drive by all the time, but you never actually get to smell? And then where is it going in the landscape? And that relates to sun and soil moisture and those things. Is it going to be a bed? And I gave you a little handout about an approach to designing a border. Or is it going to be a bed where it's going to be seen from all sides? Borders usually have some kind of backdrop that you're sort of playing off against. So a lot of these pictures come from White River Gardens in Indianapolis. So when you're thinking about designing a bed, you want to think about you're going to be able to see it from all sides, and arranging plants by height so that the tallest plants are in the center. When you're designing a border, you do need to think about the backdrop and how plants will be highlighted or blend into the backdrop, depending on what you want to do. You can use it sort of as a canvas, the backdrop, because you're only going to be seeing things from one side. And then you want to arrange the plants so you're not covering up your tall plants in the back. You want to plant in drifts or groups, masses, plant in mass rather than straight lines. So this guy has little areas lined out where he's planting, like one packet of seed will go in this area, and then here a different packet of seed, and here a different packet. And you can think about if all these little red salvia or whatever they are were grouped together, it would draw your eye much more than it does spaced out in this way. This arrangement really doesn't have any kind of impact on your eye at all. Same, if the marigolds were grouped together in mass. So rather than trying to be super orderly, planting in mass, you're going for impact. You also want to avoid doing 2, 2, and 2 of everything. Mother Nature is pretty random. You'll learn more about that in plant problem diagnosis, but throw in odd numbers, 3s, 5s, those kind of things, is usually what the landscape designers talk about. Not that you can't have 2 plants at the end of your sidewalk or something like that, But in general, you know, 2, 2, and 2 of everything doesn't make the impact that you really want out of your landscape. So this says, you know, you can see the difference here. You know, tulip here, tulip here, tulip here. Really, it doesn't have much of an impact at all. Where even just this small grouping of tulips, it really does draw your eye. Of course, the tulips aren't what I see in that picture. Anybody else see what I see in that picture? The cleaners? I see the dandelions in the picture. Yeah. Anyway, but that's a good illustration of how planting things in mass really does make a big difference. Now, this can be sort of a challenge if you're like a plant nut. You know, you go to the nursery and you've got a limited budget and you want one of everything. You don't necessarily end up with the best garden design in that way. You may have one of everything, which is great, but it's not going to make for an impactful design.
Then you know what lives, so then you go back to next year.
Well, yeah.
If you're doing pruning.
So you want to use color as an accent. You want to use color to draw your eye to things. And I will say, you know, these pictures in this presentation are not meant to offend anyone. So this person, you know, normally this would be like the bad example, you know. You wouldn't necessarily want to draw your eye to the guardrail. It's not a particularly beautiful landscape feature. However, if that's the only space that they have to grow in, it looks pretty darn nice. And I'm sure it looks better with flowers than it did without. So, but you do want to think about where you're putting color is where the eye is going to go to. So think about that as you're planning for your flower beds. So what do you guys think about this design? What do you like about this, and maybe what would you do different?
I like the overflow from the box, the bricked in, what looks like a planter.
Right.
I always like that.
Any other things that you guys like?
You can't really tell what's up by the door.
No. And maybe that's a negative. Maybe they need a little more color up closer by the door because it's difficult to see back there. The photo's not super light, so.
I don't like the vine, it looks like vines or something along the house, I don't,
Over there.
yeah, that's not my favorite.
Yeah, I think like getting into siding and up under your eaves and all that. They have things planted in mass, however, and they do have color that's sort of leading someone up to the entryway. So it does look, you know, inviting. It does make an impact. So there's enough color arranged there in a big enough group that it catches the eye for sure. And especially if you could, you know, imagine it with nothing there, if it's just all hardscape, it looks much friendlier. Definitely, you know, if you were trying to sell this house versus a house that had nothing, this is going to have much more curb appeal than a house without the landscaping. And if you compared this house to a house with no landscaping and then a house that had some landscaping, but, you know, they didn't plant in mass, it's not going to have the impact. So,
I do like to say use pink, use pink.
right, repeating the color throughout, and we're going to talk about color here a little more. But it does sort of tie it all together, for sure. You want to avoid using too many different plants. I already talked about that. I am the go to the nursery, buy one of everything person. So you just don't get the impact, you know. And then if you have so much going on, you sort of want to provide a little more definition. You can separate different foliage groups with white flowers, and that sort of will define things for you in the bed. Oh.
Okay, so don't make it back. You can lock the front door and just leave it on the table here and walk out.
Okay, which door is the front door? That door? Okay. I don't have to lock anything that way?
No.
Okay, all right. Have fun. Love the Plan Commission.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it just sort of ends up looking chaotic if you have too many things going on. So, yeah, one of the fun parts of our job, we are all statutorily assigned to serve on the Plan Commission. So I know exactly what he's headed to do. Okay. So what about this landscape? What do you guys think about this one?
Not as nice as the first one. It's boring.
It's boring. Why is it boring?
It's all in color.
Right. They don't, the color, it doesn't make an impact because there's not a lot of color. Now they have planted in mass. You know, they've done a decent job of that, but planning for bloom time, we talked a little bit about that. You know, if they had selected plants that maybe had a more staggered bloom time, you might be getting a little more impact.
I do like the feathery plants on
This is Russian sage. Yeah, it does.
the greenery matches the house.
This greenery, yeah, right. Yeah, and you know, they don't really have anything up here. It's almost like the undecorated, yeah. Right, something with some color to draw your eye up to the entrance, I think would be nice. Not that this is a bad design. I mean, I think we've all probably seen worse, but there are things that you might tweak about this that would make it more impactful more than anything else. Now, the first thing I would do is get rid of the lawn because I don't like to mow. I know some people love to mow. I am not one of those people who love. Yeah, yeah.
So stuck on that, just with landscaping too, like just you have to have a lawn and we're just so programmed. And it's hard to let that go.
It is hard to let that go. I agree. Yeah.
My sister lived in town for a long time. Her entire backyard.
Was just nice.
She had people drive down and out there to see.
Just to see it. Nice. They could have also added a little, you know, some more height back here, maybe. They have a nice backdrop here with the house, so just to create a little more scale, a little more impact. But just hopefully these examples give you some things to think about as you're advising people or as you're designing your own beds. So we'll talk a little bit about working with color. I make no claims to being an expert in working with color, and maybe that's a good thing because these are sort of guidelines that if you don't really have that talent, anybody can use. You know, I have friends, and actually my mother and my sister can put things together, and they always look great. I could put the same things together, they would not look great. So these are some things that, like I said, anybody can use to think about how to put color together in the garden. If you remember back to your, elementary art, are any of you art teachers? No? Okay. Well, if you remember back to your elementary art, you'll remember the color wheel. And you can use the color wheel to create harmony within your garden, create contrast, increase impact. One of the ways that the color wheel, and they sell gardeners' color wheels to help people think about this and put things together. One of the ways that you can use the color wheel is you might choose to just pick plants from this side of the color wheel. So you're only going to use hot colors, things that bloom in yellow or orange or reds. And if you do choose to use those colors, they give you the feeling of warmth. They give you the feeling of also closeness. So if you're using them within a small space, they can actually sort of make things feel a little more tight or controlled. If you choose to use the cool colors, they create a feeling of distance. The hot colors create a feeling of closeness. The cool colors create a feeling of distance. They create sort of calmer feelings. So if you're landscaping a very small area, you might want to think about using the cool colors over the hot colors just to create the feeling of additional space. But a lot of times you can just slice the color wheel right in half, and that would be a good way to select colors. But you can also, you don't have to slice it right along the hot colors and the cool colors. You can give it a little twist and, put the oranges and purples together, and the yellows and blues. It just gives you some ways to sort of put things together that make sense. More shifting of the color wheel. Or you can just use a little section of the color wheel. Only working with the oranges, greens, and yellows. You're not going to worry about the purples and the reds. You're just, for this one bed, going to choose to work with orange, greens, and yellows. And it helps if you do things like this, either choose, one side of the color wheel or a section of the color wheel. It helps eliminate that possibility of chaos that we talked about from using too many different textures and colors and all that kind of thing. And this is an example where they have narrowed the slice down to just one little slice of the pie, and they're really working with tints of color, lighter tints, darker tints. This is our geratum up here, and I believe this is a verbena down here. So they're just using a little tiny slice of the color wheel and putting things together. Or you could use all white. People talk about moon gardens. Have you guys ever heard? Yeah, so planting with white flowers so that at night they actually reflect the moonlight, so you get a little more night impact from the flowers. And if there's something where you're entertaining a lot at night, it might be something you want to consider around your deck or your patio. You can see that Mother Nature sort of does it also within her own design, the darker tints and the lighter tints, even within the color, the flower color itself. Another thing you can think about is echoing color throughout a design. You mentioned the pink and the pink and the pink. And here we have flowering tobacco here, and then this is a sweet potato vine that sort of has a purple or reddish tint to it, so that that color from the flowering tobacco is echoed into the leaves. Same kind of thing over here. We have the perilla or coleus with the dark pink here. Then we have geraniums and petunias that are echoing the color throughout there. Do any of you do like this color echo with containers that yeah. Well, can you give us an example of the flowers that you use when you do it?
Well, they have such pretty coleus now with all the different colors, and so I find a coleus that's got a color that matches, like, I really like, I'm not gonna be able to tell you what it is now. Pentium?
Pentium?
So if my geraniums get eaten by, the Japanese beetles so bad, so Pentiums seem to be
Immune.
So I do coleus, Pentiums, and then usually some kind of vine that's got the same color as that coleus leaf.
Yeah, sounds nice. Maybe you should bring some pictures in for everybody else next time. So this is another example. You can see another coleus here, and then the impatiens echoing the color. And here, even in the container, you can see this part has sort of a purple tint to it, and then got the perilla down here and the petunia or carabicola, I'm not sure what it is, that echoes that same color throughout. So when you're designing containers, sort of a little mnemonic device that you can use to think about your container design is that you want to look for a thriller, a spiller, and a filler. In this case, this is the thriller, something that stands up and that you can take notice on. The filler here, the perilla, fills in the area, so you don't have a lot of stuff hanging, open space hanging out. And then the spiller, especially if they're hanging baskets, you really want a spiller, But if you're just teaching somebody to do container design, it's an easy thing for people to remember, and it's sort of easy for people to pull together when they're in the nursery. They can find something that stands out, something that'll be foliage and fills in, and then something that binds and spills over. So we talked about using harmonious colors, like one side of the color wheel. Another way you can think about using the color wheel is using contrasting colors, which are the colors on opposite sides of the color wheel. And these things together do typically really draw the eye. And here's just an example. This is from the Indianapolis Museum of Art. This is, I believe, an elderberry, a cultivar of elderberry, and then we have the salvia in front, and it's very impactful, that lime green and the purple together. So another way you can use the color wheel. We talked about the intensity of colors. If you're wanting to make focal points in your garden where people are really focused, you want to use those high intensity colors, the reds, the oranges, the yellows. You want to avoid having too many focal points because that creates that sense of chaos again. But using them in a controlled way can help focus people's attention. And I'm going to show you some illustrations here in a second that'll help you see that. So the red hot poker here is pretty intense with the yellow and the red. So it draws your eye much more than the different hues of red do. So you would make that perhaps a focal point of your garden. You can see that sort of illustrated here. We've got a mass of red hot poker and then the different flowers on either side. And then if you're doing a really big bed, you can repeat that focal point even if you wanted to do 2 focal points or if you wanted to make minor focal points on either side of it. This doesn't really work if you're using really small space, but if you have a whole big backyard border that you're trying to fill in and you're working on the design, creating a particular area that you want people to focus on and then repeating that but on a different scale can help you create that design also. And then, this is like a midsummer kind of palette. If you're trying to plan for bloom throughout the year, you're also going to want to, have some kind of design in place for spring. We've got the lupin and Rose of Sharon and that kind of thing going on. And that way, you can have something blooming in your garden throughout the year. And this, can be a process. I think people walk away from this and think, oh, I could never put all that together. But it's not that you have to put it all together right now. You can add plants over time and move things around so that you are creating that focal point, lessening the chaos and that kind of thing. But the color tips are helpful, like I said, to use with somebody, especially if they haven't gardened before. They're working on designing their first beds. They're worried about making mistakes. Those can be some guidelines that you as master gardeners share with people. Use the color wheel. Think about a focal point. Think about the texture of the foliage, which we'll talk about also. But does anybody have any questions about using color or any great examples they want to share of things they've put together that all your neighbors talk about because they look so great or anything like that? Alrighty. I talked a little bit about the background, and this picture is dark, but with these bearded iris here, they're definitely going to draw your eye because there's a mass of them. They're all blooming at once. Is this what you want your eye drawn to? And then here, there's dark purple ones that don't even show up because the background is so dark. They just sort of get lost in the picture. Even if it were a brighter picture, they still wouldn't stand out very much against that hedge. So think about the background. And then foliage color. You know, there, like I said before, there's all kinds of variegations and things out there, and if you add too many of these into the mix, it takes away from the design rather than adding to the design. And then foliage texture also. In this case, I don't know, what do you guys think about the mix of these two textures? I like it too. I think it's interesting. And this is Solomon seal, which this is a variegated Solomon seal, which there's a native Solomon seal. The variegated is a cultivated variety. And then this is Japanese painted fern, which that's another way to select perennials or plants for your garden is through All-American selections or perennial plant of the year selections. So the Japanese painted fern, the Perennial Plant Association each year picks a perennial plant of the year. Japanese painted fern was the perennial plant of the year probably 10 years ago now. But basically what that means is that those plants have been tested under a wide variety of conditions and have done well without too much care and bother. So, you know, looking for those perennial plant of the year selections can help you make good choices where your chances of succeeding with them are better than some plants that might be a little more touchy. The same goes for All-American selections. The Garden Writers of America, I believe, are the ones who make the All-American selections every year. And those, they do annuals, they do vegetables. You can Google them online and you'll come up with lists of plants from years past. And again, those are plants that have been trialed in lots of different conditions and have been shown to do well, perform well under a variety of conditions. So it's something another sort of tip to think about when you're looking for plants. But I like this mixture. If you added another texture in there, it'd probably be over the top. But just the two of them together, I think, is a good mix. Okay. So let's see, where are we? As you're putting plants together, you want to be sure not to mix plants with different requirements in there. You know, things that require a lot of water versus things that don't want any water. And, you know, you guys are all gardeners, but if you're advising somebody brand new, that's something that they might not even think of. So helping them understand how often plants will need to be watered, not just when they're started, but once they're established, is another thing to think about as you're putting your beds together. This is a prickly pear cactus. It's a native, actually, cactus in Indiana. Hardly needs any water at all, and if you put it in a bed with something that needed water, like a still bee needs water all the time, you know, they're unlikely to succeed together in the same space. So it's important to think about that. Some other things to think about as you're selecting plants. Do they have bad habits that are going to require you more maintenance work or either that growing season or the following growing season? For example, these salvias, they haven't been deadheaded, and we're going to talk about deadheading if you're not familiar with that, but they haven't been deadheaded, so all the blooms have sort of fallen off and they just look scraggly and sort of pitiful. So, you know, select plants that don't need to be deadheaded. If you don't want to spend the time deadheading, you know, make those plant selections for things that aren't going to require that. Is it something that reseeds? Are you guys familiar with garlic chives? Yeah, garlic chives, they taste like chives. You can use them as a culinary plant. They also produce these nice flower heads in August, late July, beginning of August. But if you do not remove those flowers before they go to seed, you will have garlic chives everywhere. So, you know, if you're not going to be on top of that, if you go out, if you're stuck at the county fair every year at the end of July and the beginning of August and you don't have time to get it out there and remove those flower heads, don't plant garlic chives because it's a bad habit that you don't want to deal with. things that spread. There's a annual sunflower. It's a native annual sunflower that I have in my own garden. Started out with about 2 plants. It's taken over everything. And gooseneck loosestrife. That's another one that a lot of people have. That's a perennial. It's not a native. But you start out with a little tiny patch and it spreads all over the place and spreads via the root system, not through seed. So
That's the worst.
purple is, that purple loosestrife is different. Purple loosestrife is a menace in like natural areas. Gooseneck loosestrife, we haven't really found it escape to natural areas. It's just very in your garden, and it's actually not on that. I doubt it's in that. But it's called gooseneck loosestrife because the flower head actually sort of bends over like it's an attractive plant. I mean, it makes a nice impact. It's got the interesting flower head, but if you need to plant it with concrete on 4 sides because it will move on you.
My sister had a trumpet vine that literally went across the
Yeah.
alley and came up in somebody's yard as far away as that back.
Yeah, that's another one that's, and you know, we do make
They were ready to kill her.
We do make the distinction between invasive plants, which are non-natives and are a threat to our natural areas, aggressive garden plants. There are lots of garden plants, both native and not native, that will spread, but we don't really consider them a threat to our overall Indiana landscape. I really pass out this brochure because I want you to become familiar, as master gardeners. I think it's important that you become familiar with the threat that we have to our natural areas from invasive plants. My background is actually in forestry, so natural resources are sort of where my heart is anyway. But another important thing is a lot of these are still available for sale. Calorie pear, horrible invasive plant. Horrible landscape choice because it breaks. A lot of people think it stinks. I don't think it stinks, but a lot of people really find the smell horrible, and you can buy it everywhere in the spring. Same with burning bush, Japanese barberry, Norway maple, the miscanthus, the Chinese maiden grass. So as gardeners, master gardeners, I would like you to be aware of the bad guys that are specifically still available in the nursery trade and educate your fellow gardeners. Don't buy these, don't plant them. If you have them, get rid of them. A lot of the things that are already invading our natural areas are, you know, they're a big challenge, but I think this is where master gardeners can really make an impact, is helping spread the word that don't buy these plants that are still available in the nursery trade.
Just briefly, 2 weeks ago, I told you I was taking that class.
Uh-huh.
Out in the park, and apparently in the southern part of the state, the stilt grass. So you don't hear about that up here. It's like the winter creeper.
Uh-huh. Yeah, stilt grass is,
It's pretty evil, actually.
yeah, it is pretty.
Strong word, but it's,
Man. Yeah,
I
yeah,
consider
no.
stuff evil.
Yeah, and they actually have found stilt grass all the way up like in Adams County. So you do hear about different things sort of focused on in different areas, but yeah.
We can do our job by not buying it, but the problem is when you go to Rural King or you go to Lowe's, there's not enough information
No.
on the labels.
There's not. Yeah.
That's why I want to
And
go ahead.
well, they are working on that, and I will say we haven't made a ton of legislative process, but compared to where we were 15 years ago, you know, yes. So we just you have to hang on to those baby steps, otherwise it's so depressing you'd give up. Yeah. But I do think that's where you as master gardeners can make the biggest impact is, you know, calorie pear, it's a bad choice for not just the invasive part, but yes. And you know, like Japanese barberry, the fruits are poisonous. So if you have small children, it's not a good choice for planting in your.
Where does calorie pear or Bradford pear come from? Where is that? Is it an Asian?
Yep. I think it is. It actually was originally, you know, it may be a native cultivar, but It was originally thought to be sterile, and then they got two supposedly sterile varieties together, and then we have fruit and flowers and everything all over the place. So I'm not 100% sure of its origins, but in any case, it's bad news. So other things to think about, are particular plants particularly susceptible to disease issues? For example, phlox and powdery mildew. There are disease-resistant phlox out there. Choose those over the susceptible. Zinnias and powdery mildew. I'm trying to think of other disease-prone, but things. But there are some that are more disease-prone than others, so think about that. And then poisonous plants. I had somebody call me the other day that had planted castor bean. Well, he had not planted castor bean. He had decided he was going to treat moles with castor bean. And I don't know if you guys have a nuisance wildlife class, but yes, you do, wildlife control. Castor bean is not how we would suggest that you manage for moles. And then, it grows into this quite striking plant, but it is poisonous. So, you want to avoid those, especially if you have young children or maybe older adults, whatever the case may be, people who might not be able to make good decisions about what they're putting in their mouths. So thinking about what plants might be poisonous, and I gave you a list there that lists some that are of concern. And if you do ever have somebody ingest something, the poison control number is the number to call. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about color, or do you have any plants that you'd never plant again because they were such a bad actor once you got them there?
Did you say clematis?
Autumn clematis, yes.
That's not a native plant.
No.
I figured that out, I ripped it out, and I said, I'm through with you. It is everywhere. It's in my neighbor's yard, it's in the lawn, it's horrible.
Yeah. So autumn clematis has the very small white flowers, and it would be on my list as well. They are finding it in natural areas now, and yeah. And they are pretty, and that's a problem with.
Look at your neighbor's yards.
That's a problem with a lot of the native plants. They're attractive, or invasive plants. They're attractive, so that's why they ended up here in the first place. But yeah, that sweet autumn clematis is one that, trumpet creeper is one that you hear from people. I would never plant that again, just because it does spread.
I have a bush, I don't know what it is, but my landscape designer put it on one side of my house, and it shoots these little things out, and I'm constantly pulling them up.
Snipping them off.
Yeah.
Tansy is one that I would never. It's spread all over the place, and I have a reaction to it. So I have to send my husband out there to try and deal with it. So, but that's always sort of an interesting question to ask a gardener too. What would you never plant again? Instead of what your favorite plant is, what would you never plant again?
Somebody put a leafy mulberry in our, in fact, it was probably my dad. The house has been in the family forever, but we have mulberries everywhere. Everybody has mulberries. We dig up mulberries. We chop
Yeah.
mulberries.
Yeah, all over your fence row, I can imagine now. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so we'll move on to talking about how to plant them and how to take care of them so that they look good. A lot of this, if you've been a gardener for a long time, is going to be a bit of a review, but things to think about when you're advising a newer gardener. So you're ready to plant you've got a spot picked out, you moved into a new house, you've got a spot picked out, you're going to start from zero and make a new flower bed. The first thing you want to do is remove the sod, and there's lots of ways that you can do that. You could do it just by renting a sod cutter and taking it off that way. You could spray it with a non-selective herbicide like Roundup or a glyphosate type product that will kill everything. It'll kill grass and broadleaves. You could create sort of a lasagna garden situation where you're layering newspaper and cardboard and straw and building up the bed at the same time you're smothering the grass. So, a lot of this depends on your personal preference about how you want to operate and how quickly you want to get the plants into the ground and that kind of thing. Taking some time to take care of the weeds to start with, especially if you've got perennial weeds in there, is going to pay off for you in the long run as far as weeding goes.
How about the native violets? How do you get rid of those?
In your lawn or in your flower beds, yeah,
Keep coming back.
and they will keep coming back. They're hard to control. Yeah, they're relatively easy to pull.
Right.
So they don't have an extensive root system necessarily. You can yank them up, and you might.
Do the birds keep reseeding?
I was going to say you'll get reseeding,
They
but
keep coming back.
but they're not like a thistle or something like that where the root system is 3 feet deep. So you want to loosen up the soil or either loosen up the soil or create a bed through that layering system that's about 8 to 12 inches deep. You want to add organic matter to your soil, and you guys already had your soils class. So what are some of the benefits associated with adding organic matter? You remember talking about that? I know it was 2 weeks ago, and that soils class is a little overwhelming anyway because it's a lot of information. So organic matter helps what?
You're adding nutrients.
You're adding probably a relatively low level of nutrients, but you are adding some nutrients. Yep. You're improving the tilth. You're improving the moisture holding capacity of the soil. Because typically organic matter has a darker color, you may actually get the soil to warm up a little earlier in the spring, so you might be able to get into that bed earlier. You're adding sites where nutrients can attach, so lots of good reasons to add organic matter. If you're going to incorporate fertilizer, it should be based on a soil test. Too much fertilizer can cause problems just like nutrient deficiencies can cause problems. Too much fertilizer can cause insect problems, it can cause disease problems, it can cause your plants not to flower. So I don't recommend just the willy-nilly, throw some fertilizer down with it. And ideally you would do this all this prep on your new bed in the fall, but you can do it any time of year.
Do you think in this class, any kind of fertilizer, soil test class?
He should have talked about soil testing during your soils class. Did you talk about soil testing? Not so much. Okay, so I don't know what Scott recommends. What I recommend is that people get send a sample off to a lab. A lot of people ask about the little kits that you can buy on the nursery store shelves. Gives you a very small snapshot with a wide amount of room for error. So I'd suggest that you collect a soil sample and send it off to a lab. One of the labs that is here in Indiana, and I've heard good results for. We're not allowed to make commercial recommendations. There are other labs out there, but A&L Great Lakes Labs is based out of Fort Wayne. They have their submittal site or submittal form online, so you can just print the form off. You can ask for a soil test with recommendations based on your crop. So whether your crop is blueberries or flower beds or whatever, they can give you recommendations for that. And then it usually takes about 2 to 3 weeks, costs about $15, they cost $20 if you're asking for recommendations. It's a little more expensive to get the recommendations. They'll give you a report back. And then if you have any questions on the report, make an appointment with Scott 20 minutes before class next time or something, and he can go over the results with you and talk you through those recommendations. Yeah.
You said A&L or something?
A and L. I don't know what the A and L stand for, but it's A and L Great Lakes Labs. And if you Google Purdue and soil testing labs, it will give you a list of almost 25 certified. I think there's one in Indy too, but most of them you ship the sample off. We also have a publication, and there should be something in your book about soil testing. There probably is not the list of labs because that changes, but we also have a publication that talks about how to take a soil sample, because you want to sample basically the top 6 to 8 inches. Scott may have a probe that you can borrow. I have a probe in our office that people borrow, and it just makes the process a little quicker and dirtier, or not as dirty actually. Anyway, then you want to take a composite sample. So like if you're going to sample your vegetable garden, you're going to take, we'll say, 12 of these cores all around the garden, put those all into a bucket, mix it up, and then pull a sample from that, and that's what you would send off. Because the assumption is you're pretty much going to treat your whole vegetable garden the same. If you're going to apply fertilizer, you're not going to spot apply things necessarily. Now, if you have a crop that needs special growing conditions like blueberries, you might just sample that area, send that sample off, and get the recommendations for that area, because the number one recommendation is going to be acidic soils, and you're going to more than likely have to lower your acidity here. And if you had a bunch of flower beds, if you have flower beds all around the house, you could do a composite just of the different, if it was me, I'd probably sample the flower beds around my house and throw all that into a composite. Now, I wouldn't put my flower beds sample and my lawn sample in together. I would separate those two out, because when the time came to apply anything, I would treat those two areas differently based on the soil test results. Does that make sense, or does it? Okay. And Scott's here for you guys. I'm also happy to answer questions. I don't know whether my email appears at the end of this or not, but you're welcome to email me if you have questions afterwards about something I said tonight or anything like that. Or, I know invasive plants and native plants aren't really Scott's thing. So, feel free to contact me about those kind of things too. And corn and soybeans are not my thing. So, if any of you are corn and soybean farmers, I'm on board. It's just not really where, in Monroe County, we don't have a lot of traditional commodity crops, so I don't spend a lot of my time doing it. With established beds, still working in organic matter, same, you're going to get the same benefits. And then mulching, either, we'll talk more about mulch, but mulching, you can mulch with the shredded hardwood bark or mulching with compost, anything, all those eventually add organic matter.
Is there anything you don't want to mulch with that they sell out there for mulch?
People, I guess, if you're going to do some kind of permanent mulch, like rock mulch or rubber mulch, make sure you really want it permanently there. That would be my only comment. People, I've had people, how do I get rid of this rock mulch? Well, you shovel and, yeah. Or, wait epochs of time, I guess, but it's not going away. So something that will biodegrade. And, people are concerned about the dyes sometimes. The dyes are usually fine. If you are getting, it varies from county to county, the availability of things. But if you're buying compost from someone, you could ask them, like we have this place called Good Earth that takes yard waste from Bloomington and makes compost and then sells it. Those folks should be doing a compost test, like a soil test, so you can get the information on what you're actually adding. So you can, if you're buying compost from a local nursery or something, do you have test results? Can you share those with me? Just to give you some more information about, what you're putting into or where did this yard waste come from? Is it municipal waste, which may or may not have more trash in it? Or is it from a logging operation? It's just, sometimes it's nice to know a little more about where things are coming from. So as far as where to get plants, I don't know if Scott mentioned this, but we have, of course, tons and tons of extension publications online. And if you Google Purdue and whatever topic you're interested in, that you should be able to find something. But a lot of times you'll see publications mentioned, and like HO in this case means it comes from the horticulture department. E-publications come from entomology. There's a couple ID publications that are interdisciplinary. So if you see, a publication that has something there, BP is botany and plant pathology. Just so you know, it refers to the department. So if you're into seed starting, we have a seed starting publication that you can check out. Of course, garden centers and mail order, so many online and mail order sources. If you're trying out a new one, you might ask your neighbors. I was talking with one of our master gardeners at the fair, and she said she was never ordering from XX again because 2 years in a row they sent her plants that weren't the plants she ordered. You find out a lot of information by talking to your friends and neighbors. If you go to like the Missouri Botanic Garden or you go to White River Gardens and they have some plants that you just have to incorporate into your landscape, the University of Minnesota has this searchable database that will allow you to search for a particular plant and will direct you to mail order sources where that plant is available. So, if you're looking for something your grandma grew or something like that, it's sort of nice. If you guys do any kind of plant swaps or anything like that, or even when you go to the nursery, just look them over very carefully, especially for insects, disease, check out the root system. I used to live in Lexington, Kentucky. That's where I went to grad school, and then I worked for the University of Kentucky before I started working for Purdue. And they had this bluegrass orchid society, which was great because there were all these orchid growers, and you'd walk away each time with about 5 different plants because they'd bring these plants and they'd have door prizes, and they'd have more door prizes than people. But one time I walked away with scale that then proceeded to get on every plant in my house. So just look things over carefully, especially, the nurseries, hopefully they're on top of things. But the plant swaps, you can get people just bringing stuff that, of course they're not trying to be malicious or anything. Things slip through the cracks, but look them over. You want to see that the plants are putting on new growth. You don't want to see tiny little new growth, dark green new growth, and big old yellow old growth. That's an indication of fertility issues. So sort of uniform growth throughout and putting on new growth. Like I said, look over the root system, make sure it's got a good root system on it. You want it to have good color. You want the plant to be branching. You don't just want one little sprig. And if you go to a nursery and their selection's not very good, just wait, come back, go to another place. You'll end up paying for it later if your plants don't thrive because they didn't have a good root system, and then they also went through the shock of getting transplanted. So. If you're planting like a perennial, that comes in a gallon or container, you want to plant it at the same depth that it came in. So dig the pot as deep as the root ball is. You want it to be a wide hole so that there's not any restrictions on the roots establishing themselves. There's lots of references that talk about spacing, and those spacing guides are important just because as the plant matures, you don't want to have to be moving them too soon. So spacing them out at the right space will ensure once the plant is mature, your flower bed is not so overfilled that you can't tell what's what. Sometimes you'll buy plants, and you guys have probably all done this, where they've been in the nursery or in the container for such a long time, the root system it looks like a pot when you pull it out. You want to disturb that root system What I've last seen was actually, rather than making sort of these cuts into it, just cut all the way around the plant, just to help stimulate that root growth so that it branches out beyond that pot shape. A lot of times we'll have people, and this happens more with woodies than it does with herbaceous stuff, but we'll have people call us up and say, something's wrong, my plant died. And we'll go out and we'll look at the plant and, it's a dead plant and we don't see any evidence of insects or disease. And if you try and pull it up, you can pull it up like that and it comes out basically in the same size shape as the pot because it never established its root system. So doing what you can to stimulate the root system is a good thing. It's true for annuals also. And you want to plant them, I mentioned already, at the same level as the soil ball. Now, that's not necessarily true. You guys, every county does their classes a little different, so I don't know what all. You have woody ornamentals, and you have Chris Medic, who will be a great speaker, so she's going to talk about helping get your woody plants established and proper planting depth, so I won't go into that. But for these perennials, you want to plant them at the same level they've been growing at. Perennials and annuals, these herbaceous plants. So starter fertilizers, you can buy starter fertilizer, you can make your own starter fertilizer. Starter fertilizers often have high phosphorus levels because that is a root stimulator. Phosphorus is a root stimulator. So however, if your soil test has shown that your soil has adequate phosphorus and your soil temperatures are warm enough, you don't adding additional phosphorus through a starter fertilizer isn't really going to buy you anything. So that's why we recommend you have the soil test done to start with. Now, when soils are cold, sometimes plants can have trouble taking up phosphorus. But adding more phosphorus in that case isn't really going to change that fact. It's just the fact that the cool temperatures are affecting the plant physiology and it can't pick it up. If you like to buy off the 50% off bargain last chance bin, whatever they call it at your garden center, where the plants have been neglected, they look like hell, or heck, they look like heck, then a starter fertilizer might not be a bad choice. They need a boost. They've had a rough life. But in general, like I said, if your soil phosphorus is adequate to start with and you're not planting too early in the spring when the soil's too cold, adding more does not buy you anything. When to plant perennials. So in the spring, when to plant and or move perennials, I guess. In the spring, when the new growth is emerging is a good time, mid-April through May. You do want things relatively warm at that point. You don't want to necessarily worry about hard freezes. And by mid-May, by the end of April, the likelihood of a freeze is pretty low. You can move things and plant things at other times of the year. Basically, containerized plants can be planted any time of the year. But if you do, it's going to be more stressful for them, so you're going to have to pay more attention to them, make sure they're getting adequate water, that kind of thing. If you're moving things in the fall or late summer, now is the time to think about planting things and moving things. You want to allow them really a good 6 weeks to grow and get their root system established before we get too awful cold. So we want that 6 weeks to end basically at the end of September. Our first frost and freeze may not occur for some time after that, but that's a good target to aim for, is get things in the ground and established before the end of September. And although, we've had plenty of, well, at least in Bloomington, we've had plenty of moisture here lately. If you are moving things, you gotta water them in the fall too. If you end up planting later than that, you might want to think about planting it in a spot that's going to be protected until you could, if it's something that you're particularly concerned about, someplace where it will be out of the winter wind or something like that. And then adding a layer of mulch can help protect the root system also. As far as routine care goes, you hear this a lot. You had vegetables last week, so I'm sure you already heard the rule of thumb is an inch of water per week in general. I already mentioned, individual plant water requirements vary, so pay attention to that. You want to water, and hopefully they talked about this in vegetables too, you want to water less frequently and more deeply than you do frequently and shallowly. If you water deeply but less frequently, you're going to get a well-developed root system like this. If you're frequently watering, but you don't really give them that much water, you're going to get a shallow root system, which if the plant comes under any stress, this guy is going down before this one is. So
When you say the water deeply, do you mean like pour some on, let it dry, let it soak in and pour a little more? Is that
yeah. Or, we want to avoid overhead watering because that can lead to disease problems. But like if you were watering overhead a tuna can, like if you're watering with a sprinkler, a tuna can is about 1 inch deep. So, you would rather give them 1 inch at a time rather than 4 times a 1/4 inch each time. That's sort of the way we're trying to frame our thinking. You want good, thorough watering fewer times than lots of really shallow watering because you want that deep root system development. And the roots go where the soil moisture is. So if the soil moisture is just staying on the top because you're just putting a 1/4 inch in, it's not going to develop that way. Okay. Mentioned we try to avoid overhead watering mostly because of disease issues. If you are going to water overhead, and you'll hear more about this when you do plant problem diagnosis, but if you are going to water overhead in the morning rather than in the evening because the leaf surface will dry off more quickly during the day than it would at night when humidity levels rise and there's no sunlight, etc. So, but using soaker hoses or drip irrigation, it puts the water where it needs to be, which is closer to the root system, lessens the amount you have to put on because of evaporation, and lessens your disease issues. So, and you do want to water perennials into the fall until the ground is frozen. Even if you've got them in that 6 weeks and you feel like they're well established, you keep on watering, making sure they get adequate water until the ground freezes in December or whenever. I think, it's 7:30, so do you guys normally take a little break, I guess? Yeah, stand up, at least wake yourselves up. Hopefully I'm not boring you to death. I thought I brought attracting butterflies to your yard and attracting hummingbirds to your yard. But what I really brought was attracting hummingbirds to your yard and kudzu in Indiana. So if either of you or any of you are interested in either of these publications, I had some left over from an event I did. So we'll continue to distribute them, but I figured they're here. And the attracting hummingbirds talks quite a bit about, using natives and that kind of thing. So if you're interested, they're here. How's that plant class been?
It's been good.
Good? Yeah.
Yeah, we've gone out twice to, is it Deer Run?
Yeah, their park.
Right, and we actually.
Do you live down there?
No, I live here.
Here.
Thank you. I'll return this to you.
Oh, okay, thank you.
No, it's been very
Hummingbirds are
informative.
cool, aren't they?
A lot of it I already know, just because I'm interested in it.
Right.
But it's all good, and the
Nice.
battling to get it. I learned a lot, so.
Good. Is there any kind of invasive plant group here in Shelby County? No, I mean like,
What did you say?
there's,
Glass?
like in,
Oh, I'm
no, no,
sorry.
no, like in Brown County, there's that Brown County Woodland, Native Woodlands Project, where they're really focusing.
Yes, we don't have
Have it,
that.
no, yeah, and in Monroe County, we call it MC Iris, it's Identify Reduced Invasive Species, it's a horrible name.
We've got to start something. So I'm working on a number of fronts, and I'm just hoping we can get this going. Yeah, but you're right, we don't have any kind of group. I'm the only outsider, it's mostly, they all pretty much
Oh,
know each
okay,
other.
yeah.
It's okay though.
Yeah,
Embrace
well,
my presence there.
some new blood's always a good thing anyway, makes them,
Soil and Water is doing it, right, and so, a young
Scott,
woman,
let me leave this for him.
okay.
I don't know if you know her,
She's new,
Allison.
Yeah.
She just got married.
yeah,
She's cute,
Yeah.
She's lovely, so.
yeah. I used to work in Brown County before I worked in Monroe County, but, so I knew the woman who retired and who took her place, but, yeah.
Right, those are two different counties, but you're right next to each other.
Yeah, yeah.
Back here so you can see better.
Yeah, how long has that group been, you just said, how long has it been?
MC Iris has probably been there for probably 5 or 6 years. We do, they have nature days in Brown County. That's mostly, ours is called Snail Day. And then we have some other, we do surveys for landowners, go out and help them identify their invasive species. We have a really nice, we're really lucky because Ellen Jacart. Yes, Ellen lives in Monroe County and she's, yes, she is like a goddess. Anyway, so Ellen lives in Monroe County and we have this really nice chart on the MC Iris website that talks about herbicides and when to spray and what to spray and
Okay.
yeah.
It's really about education as far as I'm
Oh yeah,
concerned.
yeah,
And just informing people.
right.
And I won't chew your ear off, but I was able to save some ash trees in the city.
Oh,
in
nice.
the county, and we got Scott to help us out.
Oh, good.
And the city council, when they found out that it wasn't as much to, I said two words, cost is not as much as you think, and you're liable when that dead
Yeah.
branch falls in someone's car, and they're just like, oh, how much does it cost? And
Huh.
we did treatment.
Good.
All the city trees have been treated.
No, good. So there's some old growth woodlot out here. Yeah,
Melcher Woods.
yeah. Is it worth going to see?
It's a mile, well, it has so much winter creep, right, we're distracted by it.
Yes,
But
I understand that.
the
Yes.
trail is very nice, the land trust has done a good job, there was a parking lot, and it's beautiful, there's a state champion black ash tree, it's like 63 inches in diameter.
I had seen it in the Star not that long ago, and then I was like, "Oh, I'm going to go there," and then I totally forgot until I was driving here, and I was running late anyway. And
But it's very
Yeah.
easy to get to, from 74, or whatever highway you're taking, it's very accessible.
I came in on 44, so yeah,
I've started
So you might consider it sometime.
yeah.
the 18th of September.
It's a mile and
So I've started,
3/4.
I've got some.
Loop.
1.3 miles, excuse me.
Okay. Okay.
So big that they're getting into the new lighting. So I just been going through and trimming some stuff.
What are their names?
Wouldn't want any lavender, would you? I got 4 lavender.
What's behind them again? Where are you at? In Amazon?
Because where they're at, they get too tall.
I'm not noticed that. I guess maybe I still remember it. 'Cause we've been up there some. I went there recently, I guess. But I love
But it's right where I have a flat light.
butterfly. Have you been that far? What do they call that?
To highlight the post.
Oh, I have the white,
They're too big.
Oh,
been in that one
The
yet.
big butterfly house thing at the zoo, or just kind of inside the zoo.
Right.
That's pretty cool.
I would like to,
In,
it's just the
oh,
ticket doesn't go extra money.
you're saying if I have something, like I'm gonna get rid of some lilac or some lavender that she's gonna take, I should do it now.
Yeah. Don't.
It's interfering with some landscaping, I've got some landscape lighting, because it gets too tall.
Oh. Yeah. Now would be a good time to move it. Yeah.
Then we adopted a little girl.
I have 5 acres.
She's just started kindergarten, so we're in love with that.
We went through it because I have
That'll beat you to death, won't it? Beat me to death.
Literally
And she wants to play
have
school like it. So when she gets home, she wants to play school.
as long as this room,
Is she the
taller
teacher?
than
Oh,
me, of
sod.
sod street, because we went around
She's the
all the
teacher.
pine trees so I can quit mowing around all of them. And just made great big kidney bean shaped beds.
Uh-huh.
And I think we have like 10 single axle dump truck topsoil pulverized
Uh-huh.
soil brought in. And then about 10, no, about 3 dump trucks of the soil
Good
and
one, no?
10,
Of mulch.
12 in mulch. We were worn out.
I bet you were.
We started hiring teenagers to
Come on
help
next
us.
week.
I'm thinking, did you have a bobcat?
Well, we have a tractor with a loader,
Loader.
and I got real good at bringing it from the pile and dumping it exactly how and where he wanted it, so. It kinda irritates me, when you've paid a landscape person to can, and they put things in there that aren't paid I'm like,
Yeah.
I used to,
okay.
this summer I just could not keep up with the garden the same way, but I actually on Sunday.
Well, I was kinda laughing earlier when you talked about the plants that go
They
together.
stopped growing.
That's an unwritten rule. If you get a flower arrangement, like, cause you're in the hospital or somebody died, they always put like stuff in there that need different amounts of water.
Oh, right.
Different kinds of light, you're like, that's an unwritten rule.
I think I made peach salsa. Try that.
It's,
Yeah.
I love peach salsa.
I have enough
My
peppers.
sister said, no, they put the cheapest ones in them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mine is, I mean, it's.
I think it goes in spurts. I know, a couple years ago, I had nothing but. And
Take this off while I go to the bathroom since you don't know how to turn it on.
I'm sure they'll appreciate it.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy.
We have some people calling
Do you
to
remember
talk
when I
conferences,
used to work
and
for
they're
our
from Europe,
house?
China,
Yes.
wherever, Singapore, and sometimes
We had this
they're calling
young
from
gal
home,
working at the
and they
bank.
forget to put it on mute, and they.
Oh,
Literally came in
no.
the bathroom today. Yeah, I mean, I had a phone call. I said,
You're
so
like,
take a message. And she said, well, we're gonna get you one of those head things that, where you can have it all the time. I said, I'll still take it off, what else in there?
I
I said, for Pete's sake, there's some things you get to have privacy for.
No, you don't. She's just lecturing on her slides, and the slides are not being handed out
So
because
it's
there
up
are so
to you
many
ready
color
for
ones.
a sauce.
Yeah, I
So
use
they're
that,
like,
and I use
well,
that
duh.
sauce forever. It's even good just out of the
Except for
pan,
cousin,
heat it up.
goes
So
to
you
the-
have
he works at the game, and she came home last year, towards the end of the year, she said,
Well, I got this
broke my
nice
phone, or my phone
chicken.
didn't work anymore. And her
Everything
last
goes in
year,
it, and
somehow it fell in the
it's thrown
toilet.
out, and the juice gets
That's
separated.
nice.
John did that
Kansas
one time.
separate.
He came home little, he'd gone to see a customer from out to lunch, went to the restroom, and he had a thing in his belly.
Did you get last week carrots?
So Aaron had you remember Aaron? Aaron had had a phone exactly like this. Aaron had lost his phone. He had to fix that. You could walk into his room and you couldn't find a thing. So when he lost his phone, we said,
Yes.
you gotta pay for it. So he went out and got a different phone. About 3 weeks later, I happened to walk through his room on the way to the storage closet, and I'm like, hey, right there it was, on top of this chest of drawers, right at my eye level. I picked it up, and when he got home, I said, is this what you've been looking for? He said, so John comes
But
out,
right
and
now-
he had dropped his phone.
And I did
I
have
pulled the
my
SIM
phone
card out
last year.
and put it in Aaron's phone, old phone, because it was the same phone. The only problem is, Aaron had made his ringtone a belch. And no matter how many times we programmed it to get rid of that, it would be gone for a couple of weeks and then it would come back to life. He says, that's so embarrassing in front of a customer. I said, so put it on silent.
I'll go ahead and get going again. But you guys feel free to get more melon or do anything else you need to do. We talked about the need to do a soil test. If you do end up having deficiencies, working them in and working the nutrients that you might be missing in at the beginning of the growing season into the soil would probably be the preferred way to deal with it rather than trying to apply it foliarly or anything like that. But if you're adding organic matter and your soil test turns out okay, you don't really need to regularly fertilize. I'll show you a picture here in just a second of what plants look like when they've got some nutrient issues going on. And there are lots of different pictures out there of nutrient deficiencies. It's sometimes hard to tease out what's a nutrient problem and what might be an environmental problem, but this is a good indicator. I already mentioned if the phosphorus level is accurate, more is not better. It's not going to increase either root growth or flowering, so don't think that you're doing more by adding more. You may be creating problems. We recommend, especially with the perennials, you don't fertilize after August 1st because it can encourage things to put on new growth, and it should be sort of shutting down mode rather than new growth mode. With woodies especially, like I said, Chris is going to talk about this, but if woodies put on new growth and it's not hardened off before the cold weather hits, you're just going to have a bunch of dead tips next year. If you have some plants that are particularly long bloomers, adding a little fertilization mid-bloom time might increase the vigor, make them last a little longer, look a little better. With containers and houseplants also, the coated, the Osmocote, so that its time-released application is handy to have. Containers, when they're in the nursery at the greenhouse, they are fertilized all the time. So that's something where you're flushing out fertilizer as you're watering all the time, because you should be watering so that water is running out. So they need regular fertilization in order to maintain that growth and vigor. If you don't do that, your containers are going to look relatively pitiful when you compare them to something that you buy at the nursery. So this is the picture I mentioned. You can see here the old leaves are sort of large and yellowish, and the new growth is relatively small, especially when you compare it to these plants. So this is a good indicator that probably nitrogen in this case is what's lacking. It's not impacting the bloom necessarily, but you can see it in the foliage. So this was maybe something where a granular was applied or where a fertilizer was watered in, but they missed this section and treated this section. Everybody can see the difference there. Old yellow leaves, small new growth. It's a good indicator you need some fertilizer. As far as weeding goes, weeds compete for water, nutrients, and sunlight, and they don't really help the aesthetic much. If you're a kind of person who, I say much because I had this whole conversation today. Sorry, I'm going off track here, but I had this whole conversation today. We converted part of our courthouse lawn that used to be euonymus and burning bush to exotic, from Asia, invasive species, and planted Indiana natives all along this one border. I think it's gorgeous. Got some feedback today from the secretary about the weeds, and when was I going to take care of the weeds? And anyway, it's all in the eye of the beholder. Anyway, so ruin the aesthetics, like I said, is all in the eye of the beholder. Pulling them out, if you're the kind of person, I have a master gardener, Barb. She is in every flower bed every day. She's retired and has the time to do it, and she has a weed-free garden for that reason. I have a weed full garden. We're at the point where we're just going in with a machete at this point. Yeah, yeah. So, staying on top of weeds is really the key to making it tolerable. Once it gets to the machete level, it just is so discouraging, and you don't even know where to start. But so pulling them out, cutting them off. This is a stirrup hoe. These work great in vegetable gardens, and depending on your space in your flower garden, they can be useful. These Japanese type hoes, and they come in lots of different shapes, can get you into places that'll allow you to cut off the weed below the ground level. Herbicides can be great. They can be difficult to apply in the middle of a flower bed. We were just talking the other day about somebody who had thistle coming up all over the place in their Pachysandra, and how could they treat that? You could spray it, but you'd have to be very careful. And a lot of times I tell people, especially with poison ivy, people get poison ivy coming up in their flower beds. You can sort of create a little room or backdrop around the poison ivy with cardboard and spray it that way. Another way you can treat it, and of course you need to read the label. The label is the law. Need to read and follow the pesticide directions. But so one way that you can treat some of the sturdier weeds is you can put on a latex dishwashing glove, and then put on a jersey type glove, and then dip into your Roundup, your glyphosate mixture or whatever, and then run your hand up and down the stem of that plant. And that's a good way to get herbicide on in a very targeted way, so you don't have to worry about overspray or drift or any of that kind of thing. How many of you use preen in your, we've got one. So preen is a pre-emergent herbicide, which basically means it works on the seeds before they even start growing. It has to be applied before weed seed germinates, and it can't be applied in beds where you're planning to plant seeds, because it will work on those as well. But beds where you're going to plant live plants into them, plant annuals, plant perennials, you can treat the bed with preen, and basically all the weed seed will be prevented. Most of the weed seed, a high percentage of the weed seed will be prevented from germinating, and you won't have that problem. It does need to be watered in well and worked into the soil. A lot of people use preen regularly in their beds. And typically it's done, like I said, in the spring. About the same time you treat for crabgrass. If you treat your lawn for crabgrass, April 1st is sort of the target date for treating your lawn for crabgrass. It's lots of seed germination going on then. So pre-emergent herbicides can be effective. Mulching, it says don't weed, mulch instead. Well, mulch isn't going to get rid of your weeds. It's not like a silver bullet, but it can help cut down on the amount of weed that you're dealing with. The most common problem with mulch is that people apply too much. They go for, again, if a little is good, more is better. No, because your plant root systems need air exchange. So they don't need 6 inches of mulch. 2 to 3 inches of mulch is good. If you're mulching later in the year, you can apply a little more, but generally 2 to 3, and then people end up getting around 3 typically. If you wait to apply mulch till the soil is warmed up, things will grow more quickly. That's what that second line means. If you mulch early in the season, it's just going to take longer for your soil to warm up. So, anybody have any questions about mulch? Like I said, the biggest problem with mulch is that people apply too much. You don't want to necessarily, it's better to mulch in a donut rather than a volcano. Giving some space between the plant stems and the mulch is a good thing. You can see it there. They've left a little space right there. So it's not right up against the plant.
There's so many different kinds of mulch. What kind of guidelines do you use?
Well, any kind of organic mulch, anything that will break down and decompose, can be okay. A lot of people are concerned about adding mulch and then plants becoming nitrogen deficient because the microbes are taking up nitrogen. And that all is true. But that whole nitrogen process is a cycle. And as microbial populations decompose and ebb and flow, they both take up nitrogen and release nitrogen. So that's not really a concern. A lot of people are like, oh, I can't mulch, I'll have a nitrogen deficiency. That's not really a concern. Mulch helps you retain soil moisture. It does help cut down on the weeds. It's attractive. I mean, it helps to improve the aesthetics. So really what's available to you is, we'd recommend organic rather than rubber or rock. A rubber is never going to break down, and even when you're ready to get rid of it, you have no place to go with it. Rock, you might be able to fill in your driveway, but most people that I've dealt with that have had rock mulch have been dissatisfied with it at some point down the line. So some other tips to make your garden look good. Tall plants may need to be staked. Do any of you successfully grow delphiniums? Well, they're lovely, huge blue flower heads, beautiful. A lot of times you see delphiniums like this, though. Yeah. So, if you want your beautiful flowers to be seen and create that impact that we talked about before, those kind of flowers you're going to need to stake. And when you're staking, stake them early so the plant actually grows up through the stake rather than trying to get in there, these relatively delicate plants anyway, and stake them after the fact. Tie them like you would a tomato so they've got some room for movement. You're not like tying them down for the hurricane that's about to come. You're really just trying to keep them from flopping over. And you want them shorter than the full height so that people aren't focusing on the stakes. They're focusing on the plant. And some may not require stakes necessarily. I have a gray coneflower at home. It's a big mass. I have to tie it up, just, burlap twine around about halfway up. Otherwise, it just flops out into the middle. But it's not tall enough. It's something I would stake up, but it still needs to be tied up. Pinching is when you remove the plant's growing tip to increase the growth of the foliage and or to encourage the plant to put on more flower buds. And this is an example of pinching, and you really just do it with, your index finger and your thumbnail. You really do just pinch. The tissue is succulent enough, you can take it right off like that. Things like chrysanthemums need to be pinched, as I said, to make them bushy, to encourage flower buds. We would pinch those normally until the 4th of July, and then we'd let them go ahead and set their flower buds so that they're all ready to bloom in the fall. If you don't pinch, you're just going to get sort of tall, spindly plants, and they're going to be less attractive. So it helps keep things looking good. Pinching can also stimulate branching so that you get more flower bud production, more overall blooms, hopefully. And this is a Joe Pye weed, and an example one that's not pinched versus one that's pinched. It's going to be a fuller plant. Same plant, but it's going to take up more area in your garden. And if you stagger the pinching or the cutting back, you can also stagger the bloom time so that you can extend the bloom time a little bit. If you pinch a third one week, a third the next week, and a third the following week, the third of the plants in your flower bed, then it's going to stagger the bloom.
Does that work in deadheading too?
Deadheading also encourages new blooms, so yeah.
I mean staggering the deadheading.
Well, it will work the same way. You'll still have if you stay on top of the deadheading, I was going to say you're still going to have deadheads hanging out there, and you will. But yeah, just routinely going in there both encourages new blooms and gets rid of the spent flowers. With these annuals, this is a celosia. If you buy them from the nursery, especially if they already have a bloom going, you might want to go ahead and pinch back that bloom. That's going to encourage more bloom down the line. Otherwise, again, you might just get a spindly, not very attractive looking plant. And this is especially true of plants that are just grown for their foliage. You want to pinch them. Some of these slides, well, we're going to send you the whole presentation, so never mind. I was going to say, I will specifically send you some of these slides, but you're going to get the whole presentation, so you'll have these lists. And this is just maintenance, cutting off the terminal flowers if the plant is not branching, again, just to encourage fuller growth. So they say especially important for celosia and salvia, and then several others that benefit from this. You get many more blooms, like on something like zinnia, if you pinch it back than you would if you just let it go. And this is just an example of that staggered pinching or pruning. This phlox here, the bloom is sort of spread out because it has been sequentially pinched, and therefore the flower buds are spread over a longer period of time. So deadheading is basically going in and taking off spent flowers. Why do you think you'd want to deadhead? If you were going to explain to a new gardener why you should deadhead, what would you say?
It encourages new blooms.
Okay, it encourages new blooms. What other reasons might there be?
More attractive.
It looks better, yep. Any other reasons?
Is the plant expending any energy on that dead?
I always figure it is.
Yeah, they're putting energy into seeds, into developing fruits and seeds, so,
Energy's going into
So
new.
it would free them up.
yep. And another big one is, so it doesn't produce seeds, like the lovely garlic chives. So you don't have to deal with the mess that you have later if you don't do it. So the reasons to do it, it can make the garden look really good. It encourages plant flower again. You don't have 4,000 seedlings everywhere that you have to deal with. It is a lot of work. The seed heads of some plants can be attractive, and they're not just attractive to us, but can be attractive to wildlife if you're trying to attract birds and butterflies. Especially birds, seeds are attractive. And, if you do like those seedlings, sometimes you want things to reseed and produce new plants. So reasons to do it, reasons to not do it. The bigger question, not so much the do it or don't do it, is where to deadhead. And this can be a little tricky, really, especially if you're not that familiar with how plants grow or how a particular plant grows. So you want to take it back to basically where the plant and where the flower stalk and the leaves attach. So, you wouldn't do it up here like they're showing on this one, but you would do it down here at the base of where the flower stalk attaches to the leaf. And here, they weren't too far off. They're about 1 inch off, but they shouldn't deadhead there. That's just going to stick up there like that stub for the rest of the season. They should go down here where the leaf attachment is and deadhead it at that point. And here they show it, with scissors, but you can go in and deadhead, if, depending on the thickness or stoutness of the stem, you can deadhead a lot with just your fingers. Here they're deadheading this allium, this ornamental onion. I probably wouldn't even deadhead that just because those seed heads are interesting. They add interest to the garden. And here you can see right there is where the leaf joins the flower stem, and they're cutting it off right there. So that one looks good.
Can you deadhead your coneflowers? Will that help them or not?
Yep, it'll help produce more blooms. You may want to stop deadheading like end of August or later, just because the seed heads, like the goldfinches, love the coneflowers. If you're interested in having wildlife, some people like a tidy, neat garden in the winter, and you may be taking all that out, but this is probably not the way you want to deadhead. At least if you're worried about the way things look, this is not the way you want to deadhead. Now, they maybe have totally been focusing on, we don't want the energy to go into the seed production, we want it to go into the bulb. So maybe they just took off the, yeah. Anyway, that would be a no in general. You would go, if you were going to deadhead tulips, which I would not deadhead tulips because the foliage dies back relatively soon after the plant itself does, you would go all the way down there into the base. Sometimes, there are so many flower heads and you're just trying to clean things up, just shearing things off works well. And shearing will help encourage new growth also. With this many stems there, taking each one individually, that should be a punishment, not a garden chore, yeah. Be careful where you do deadhead. If you deadhead it all the way back down to here, you're gonna lose future blooms. You're thinking these are the spent flowers, and they are, but you're gonna take this off if you went all the way down there. So gotta pay attention to that. Where would you deadhead this red hot poker? All the way down here at the bottom, yep. And the purple coneflower, right, I would go right to there. And then you're gonna get new growth stimulated. You'll probably get new flower buds right in that corner or the leaf below. So you can also cut back, like this is columbine, and after it flowers, it just sort of looks cruddy. It looks all spent and lanky, and it'll hang out there like that, but you can cut it back and it'll put out a new flush of growth that's a lot more attractive. You can do that too with columbine. Gets the columbine leaf miner, which is a little bug that eats between the layers of the leaves, and it looks like a snail trail almost through the leaf. If you got a lot of columbine leaf miner damage and it's bugging you, you can just cut that all back and it'll put out a new flush.
Cut it back down to 6 inches above?
Down to right down real close to the ground. Yep. And then there's some others, lady's mantle, perennial geranium, that you can do that too. Any questions about deadheading or pinching or any other maintenance tips you guys want to share with each other? Well, the whole deadheading thing is like weeding. If you stay on top of it, it's great. If you get behind, it's a little overwhelming. So at some point, with your perennials, they may outgrow the space that they're in. They may end up with a dead center like this clump of grass has. They may have stopped flowering. Daffodils are one that if you've got a lot of daffodil foliage but you're not getting any flowering anymore, that may mean that your daffodil bulbs need to be dug up and divided. You just want more plants. I got a whole spot over here that a tree died and I got to fill in. I need some more plants and I don't want to spend a lot of money. So you can divide your perennials. And you can divide pretty much any time of the year. You're more likely to have success in the spring or the fall. But if you divide later in the, into the summer months, as long as you're willing to care for it and baby it, they can get through it. But again, in the spring, you'd want to leave 6 weeks before it got super blazing hot. You'd want to do it early enough. In the fall, you'd want to leave 6 weeks for it to get established before we got really cold. Some species, it's easier to do as the growth emerges, like for example, sedum or the ornamental grasses. As they're coming up, they're easy to do. Things like daffodil or tulips or those kind of things, it's easier to do after they're done flowering. Once the foliage is sort of dying back, you've given them their 6 weeks of photosynthesis time and the tips have started to die back, that's a good time to dig up daffodils and divide them. Things like bearded iris, daylilies, and hostas, they can pretty much tolerate division anytime. Those are tough plants. You can dig up a daylily and like leave it on the blacktop for 3 days and then put it in the ground and it'll still grow. So I've abused some daylilies pretty good and they're still hanging in there. So other things like peony seem to prefer the fall, Siberian iris. The spring native woodland ephemerals, things like bloodroot, trillium, etc. They recommend moving them in the fall, but you will have had to mark them in the spring or you will be out of luck. And a lot of times, they're not so crowded that we need to divide those. They're relatively slow growing and slow spreading, so it's not often that you need to divide spring woodland ephemerals. So just some slides on how to do a division, and this is an example mostly with grass, although we throw a iris in there for a few for the end. But so if you've got a lot of growth up or it's in the fall, trimming back the foliage, one, makes the process easier, but it also, the plant has less foliage then that it needs to support after its root system has been disturbed. So trimming back the foliage has 2 purposes. One, just to make the process less cumbersome, and 2, because the ratio of root system to leaf area then is a little more balanced. So you trim back the foliage, you dig up probably the whole plant, the whole circle that had the dead center, you dig that up. You divide it. With grasses, you can divide it multiple times. With something like hosta, you have to make sure you have a growing point there, a cluster of leaves have attached to a particular point. You don't want to shave off such a small part. You're not going to have enough tissue to grow. Daylilies are easy too. They're easy to divide. And then you want to plant it back in the ground. And, ideally you'd probably do this on an overcast day when maybe it was a little cooler, not blazing hot, try to lessen the stress as much as possible once it's in the ground, and then making sure it gets adequate water until it's established. So it's pretty simple. Does anybody have any other tips on dividing perennials that they've... It's one of those things you just need to do it some and feel confident about doing it. There are a few things that don't like to be divided. And there's other ways to propagate these, like butterfly weed. It has a very long taproot, so it's not easily divided, but it readily grows from seed as long as they have gone through a cold period. Baptisia, that is not basket of gold, that is false indigo, so that's error on the slide there. It's another one that doesn't like to be divided, but it will have root sprouts. It also grows from seed. So anyway, oriental poppy, not a big fan of being divided. Balloon flower, there are some that just don't really like it a whole lot. So like I said, you'll get a list of those when you get this presentation. So after all the blooming is over, you've established your flower bed and have a fabulous design, and you've gone through a great growing season. Time to think about the winter and how to care for them and get you into the next growing season. You can leave quite a few things that will add winter interest to your yard. Things like Joe Pye weed and the Baptisia with the seed pods, those kind of things add. Annuals, they don't add a lot of winter interest. They usually just look dead. So I would remove those. Leaving some old foliage, just sort of creating an air layer close to the ground, may perhaps help a perennial survive if it's a severe winter and if it's a particularly susceptible plant. If you have had problems with pest or disease, then you're better off cleaning up and get that plant out of there. For example, this year, how many of you have dealt with head clipping weevil, which you will see on things in the sunflower family and the aster family? Coneflower, Lots of people see it on coneflower. It's this little weevil, so it's a little insect with a little snout. And the female sort of unzips the top just below the flower, leaves it hanging on by a string so that the flower flops over. I have it all over this stiff goldenrod that's in my yard. So just before they bloom, the bloom flops over. Then the female lays her eggs in that flopped over flower head. The flower head falls to the ground, and that's where they overwinter. So if you don't clean all those up, I'm just going to have even more head clipping weevil next year. And that's true, with diseases as well. You want to remove the pathogen as much as possible. So things with powdery mildew, that kind of thing, get them off site. Most of us, did he talk about composting much when he talked about soils? Well, most home gardeners, and myself included, you have to raise the temperature of your compost pile to about 130 degrees over 2 weeks period in order to feel confident that you have killed pathogens. Most home composters, one, don't have a pile big enough to get it that hot, don't manage it by turning it enough to keep it that hot, so you should not really plan on being able to kill pathogens if you're a composter, unless you're a really aggressive composter. So we recommend, and that goes for weed seed also, if you've got it, weeds that have gone to seed and or diseased plant material, add it to your burn pile and burn it if you're allowed to burn wherever you live, or bag it, but don't compost it. Okay. In the winter or in the spring, once new growth starts to emerge, you want to cut back anything that you left for that winter interest. So cut back once your ornamental grasses start growing up. Cut them back early in the spring. Your sedums, in this case, cut them back. It just gets to the point where it takes more time to cut them back because you're going to have to cut back individual stems. And then with grasses, if you let it go too far, you've got new grass mixed enough in with old grass that it's really not worthwhile. We don't recommend, we still see some people burning their ornamental grasses in the spring. We don't recommend burning because you can achieve the same result by not burning, and you're adding to air pollution basically by doing that. I mentioned containers already. Number one rule, and rule 1 through 10, is that the pot must have holes. And more, it seems like they sell pots without holes. So, find your drill and your masonry bit and put a hole in there. You want to use soilless potting mix. It doesn't compact, it's lighter. So, if you need to move the container, it's movable. Holds more moisture and air as well. But it doesn't hold a lot of nutrients, and that's why you need to fertilize containers on a regular basis. Depending on the container and where you're putting it, you can need to water up to twice a day. If it's in a really sunny, hot spot, it can dry out very quickly. Add enough water. Again, when everything you want to water deep. So you want to water it enough that the water is running out of the container. Don't just give it a little shot on the surface. Okay. Any other care tips that you guys have to share, or things that have really added to the winter interest in your garden because you leave it, or anything like that? If not, we'll start going through some of the common problems that you'll find in your flower garden. And this is really where you're going to probably hear things repeated in later classes, like during your insect class or during your plant problem class. They won't be, full-on overlap or repeats, but it'll definitely be, oh yeah, we heard about that kind of thing. And if you have any questions at any point, just stop me and let me know. So we'll first talk about environmental problems that you might encounter in the garden, and then we'll go through common insects and diseases. So what does this look like to you guys? Your garden.
Looks like my irises.
Uh,
Take a picture.
well, if it weren't daffodils, you would think it might be frost damage. Daffodils are pretty resistant to cold temperatures. So, but a lot of times frost damage will look like watery, wilted tissue. But in this case, that's not the greatest picture. That's actually burn damage, where somebody had burned a pile right next to the daffodils. So, but you know, it's an example of environmental. They didn't think about how close their flowers were to where they're burning. We're not going to talk. Hang on, I'm out of order. Let me switch to. Let me find the slide I need to be on. Okay, this is where I think we need to be, and we'll go back to those other ones. So, keeping in mind when the average last frost date is in the spring is one thing that people, especially new gardeners, don't know. So they'll put things out too early, and then they'll get hit by a frost and have watery-looking damaged plants, or plants that aren't going to bloom because they got them out too early. So I'm not sure which county is Shelby. Is that Shelby?
That's it,
Yeah, so your average last frost date is, for most of the county is April 17th through April 23rd. So average last frost date means 50%. Yeah, 50-50. Generally in Monroe County, we say Mother's Day. You can fly free around Mother's Day, set things out, and the likelihood that you're going to have a frost is very minimal, although I think we did have a frost after Mother's Day this year. So we shouldn't have another one for a long, long time. But knowing when your average last frost date is important. Yeah, after less than 5% chance. And this is what frost damage looks like. The leaves are watery, wilting, usually a problem with annuals. Perennials in general aren't impacted by frost. Sometimes you will lose flower buds, or if they're early spring flowerers, they might just lose the actual flower, will turn brown and watery like that. And then not having things established in the fall, that's you guys. So your average again is October 10th through October 16th. Again, it's an average. And that's why we say, end of September, it's great to have things already in the ground 6 weeks by the end of September, because that gives you some wiggle room if you happen to get an early frost, or it just gives them more time to be in the ground if you get a late one. So there is Indiana, and this is more for vegetables, and maybe hopefully they talked about this last week. There is another HO publication that is the Indiana Vegetable Gardener Planting Calendar that has these two maps in there. What plant is this, and what kind of damage are we seeing here? Yep, it's a hosta, and who's the culprit? What's the culprit? Yep. Slugs are the most common pest, besides deer, of hostas. And slugs are easier to deal with than deer, really. But they'll eat a lot of this. Hostas are often grown in the shade. Slugs like moisture. Hostas are often grown very close together, so you don't get a lot of airflow, things drying out. There is a E45 publication that deals with how to control slugs. Have you guys done slug control? Anyone? What have you used to do slug control? Pinching them. Yep, that works. I know somebody who lays a board down and then stomps on the board and takes them out that way. When I ask that question, people will say things like, I put eggshells down, crumbled eggshells, because the myth is there that slug will abrade their body as they crawl over the eggshells. I've not heard sandpaper. Yeah. It's not enough of an abrasion to dry them out.
Heard salt.
Salts will dry them out. So, yes. They leave slime trails. They chew holes in the leaves. People also say beer. They'll leave out cans of beer. There's this great book, at least I think it's great. It's called The Truth About Organic Gardening that talks about some of these garden myths or garden home remedies. And the guy who wrote the book was a professor at Michigan State, and he actually did studies on these home remedies. And beer can be effective. But the thing with beer, people would put out little cans, they'll say tuna cans of beer, and they'd fill it to the very top. And the slugs are attracted to the yeast smell. So they'd come and they'd have a great old time drinking the beer. The key is to put the beer in a shallow enough container that they will fall in rather than just stand at the bar and drink. So anyway, but E85 will give you some other information on control. Yeah. Yeah, it's easy to put like a Far Side kind of cartoon. Cultural things like removing decaying plant matter and mulch, raking to dry out your mulch, getting some airflow going. There are slug-resistant hostas, not watering late in the day, where I talked about other reasons you might not want to do that. Collecting getting them to find a home under things and then squishing them or collecting that. Copper bands do work. They won't crawl up the leaves, the copper slug baits, and the entomology publication talks about the different kinds of slug baits that are available to you. And then here's the list of slug-resistant hostas. So those might be a consideration also. And like I said, you'll get that list when we send you this. What's this one? Yeah, powdery mildew. And can anybody tell what plant that is on at that point? It's not much of the plant. It's on phlox, which commonly does get powdery mildew if it's not a resistant variety. Powdery mildew is sort of an umbrella name. There's powdery mildew on lilac and dogwood, and all those are sort of species specific, but they all have similar signs, and they're all caused by fungi. So we just sort of lump it under powdery mildew. Phlox, zinnia, and bee balm are probably the most common herbaceous. Bee balm is also known as monarda. But the leaves will get the leaves and the blooms also will get the powdery film on them. And depending on how severe it is, you may lose some leaves. Usually the whole plant won't die, but you'll lose some leaves. The disease likes it when it's humid and the temperatures are high at night. So we see a lot of it later in the summer. Yes, your question.
I'm having trouble with Zinnia that is planted in the ground getting that, but not the ones I've got in pots.
So that may be to do with airflow and how much air movement you get. Disease prevention has a lot to do with how long there's moisture on the leaf surface. Even if it's moisture, we can see. So your container pot may be on the porch where you get more of a breeze than the flower bed is. Or the flower bed, there may be more flowers around it, so you're not getting. You planted the container with soil from a potting soil mix, so it didn't have any powdery mildew spores in it. You planted the seed or whatever in the ground in the flower bed, and there were spores present. So it's the proximity of the pathogen also. But this is a really pretty common garden problem. There are resistant varieties available, especially of phlox. This is one where if you have excess nitrogen, the plant appears to be more susceptible to powdery mildew, so not over-fertilizing. Sanitation, if you have the problem, making sure you clean up from last year. With fungicides, what's available to homeowners are actually preventative products, so they need to be applied prior to when the symptoms are appearing, the signs or symptoms are appearing. So if you sprayed this plant now with a fungicide, it's really more revenge spraying than actually benefiting plant health. Because it's already impacted. You would need to spray when the environmental conditions indicated that disease development is likely. And that timing can be very difficult. It can be very difficult to time it right to start with and then stay on top of it as we get rain or heavy dew or other things that might wash a fungicide off. So that's why planting resistant varieties and doing these other things to lessen the likelihood of disease is a better approach than necessarily thinking you're going to solve all your problems with a chemical application. Not that chemicals aren't a tool that you want to consider in your toolbox, but even if they are a part of your toolbox, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be problem-free. How about these guys? Aphids, yep. So aphids are little they have piercing sucking mouth parts, yes. And so they reproduce by sticking their little stylus in and sucking plant juices. A lot of times you can have high aphid populations and the impact on plant health sometimes isn't that great. If they are impacting plant health, you'll see distorted foliage, that kind of thing. You can get other things that also cause distorted foliage, but piercing sucking insects is one of them. Aphids aren't always necessarily bright yellow like these guys are. Sometimes they're almost clear, sometimes they're light green. They always have these little two tailpipes sticking out of them. Another thing that they do is when they suck the plant juices and then they poop out their frass or insect, feces, which also is known as honeydew. And then mold will sometimes grow on the honeydew that's produced by the insects. So you can have sooty mold on a plant. It'll be like black sooty mold, just like the name describes. And people will think, well, what's going on? How can I treat this mold? When actually they need to be treating probably the aphid that's causing it rather than the mold itself. And like I said, many plants, you can have aphid problems and you won't show any ill effects. Another way to treat them, I don't know if I talk about this. Sometimes you can just, if it's a plant that will tolerate a hard spray of water, you can put your thumb over the hose and spray it down and knock the population back enough that it's an effective way to deal with them. One cool thing about aphids is that not all of them, but some of them can actually be born pregnant, so their reproduction rate is it's like out of Alien, it's pretty freaky. Another way to control them, I mentioned the forceful spray of water. Ladybugs are aphid lovers, both the adults and the larvae eat aphids. There are a number of other insects that also eat aphids. Insecticidal soaps can be effective. Horticultural oils basically smother them. And then there are conventional insecticides that are also labeled for aphid control. Why something doesn't flower? Can anybody tell me guess what this flower is from that lovely photo? It's one of the earliest spring flowers. It's a hellebore or a Lenten rose. And so normally they're not damaged by frost because they're pretty cold hardy. But if they are damaged, it's likely to be the flower that's going to end up being damaged. And we talked a little bit about this already, but when you, as a master gardener, somebody finds out you're taking the master gardener class, oh, well, you must know why my plant won't flower then. There's lots of reasons that a plant may not flower. If it's a perennial, it may not have reached the maturity state where it can produce flowers and fruit. Maybe it flowered and they missed it. Sometimes flowers are not super obvious, or sometimes because of weather conditions, the flowers fade faster than they predicted. Was there a late frost that killed the flower buds, and so therefore you didn't notice any flowers? Was it over-fertilized so that the plant put all its energy into producing leaf tissue and none into producing flowers and fruit? Is it under the wrong growing conditions? Too much shade, too much water stress? Was it divided last year and therefore had a little setback and needs some time to catch up? So, people a lot of times just want one answer to everything, and often there's not just one simple answer. It could be a couple different things. Maybe the shade level is right on the borderline, but you also had a little too much nitrogen. So, it can be confounding factors. More problems in the garden, leaves that are the wrong color. One thing you'll find out in your plant problem diagnosis class is that different symptoms can have, similar symptoms can have different causal agents. So you may have yellowing leaves, and that may be because you don't have enough nitrogen, or maybe you just have too little light. Or maybe you have too much light and the leaves are bleached out. Or it's had too much water. It's had root stress. It's not taking up the air through the roots that it needs to. So when you see these kinds of problems, it's going to take a little more investigative work. And your plant problem diagnosis class will talk about putting those pieces together to figure out what's going on. So in this case, we've got a little contorted foliage here, and this is on a woody stem, but it can happen on herbaceous plants as well. And that can be one thing that can cause contorted foliage or distorted foliage is herbicide damage. Cupped leaves, twisted leaves, rolled or stunted. You can see the normal growth over here and the herbicide damage over here. Have any of you guys ever noticed that kind of damage? Yeah, is that because of something you did yourself? No?
Farmer around us.
Yeah. Yeah, if you have farmers around you, could happen for sure. Do you have a pesticide class? Well, you can talk about that thing. So we talked about the need to stake particularly tall plants, and you need to stake them early rather than, once they are already up there. Wildlife, you spend a whole 3 hours talking about wildlife and the trouble they can cause, how to determine who's causing the trouble, and then solutions for that. There is also and they'll mention this in the class, I'm sure, there's a website that talks about the life cycle and other information with wildlife that can help you figure out how to make things less hospitable for them. Hopefully they'll move on to somebody else's yard. So some general rules to go by to help your garden look good: choosing disease-resistant plants, picking out healthy plants in the nursery, avoiding overhead watering so that you're not encouraging disease development, leaving enough space between plants so that you get good airflow, reduces disease, and then if you've had a problem, cleaning up after the problem, whether that's insect or disease, will help lessen the chances you're going to see the same problem next year. And we're going to send you this, so even if you don't get it all down. So botrytis is also known as gray mold. It has a wide host range. A lot of different plants are impacted by botrytis. In this case, you've got a marigold here and a pansy. Usually when there's wet weather, we've had a lot of wet weather this year. We've had a lot of disease problems in general this year. Botrytis is often seen on the flowers. Peony gets botrytis relatively regularly. Cleaning up, again, sanitation, removing those diseased blooms will help you with the problem. Aster yellows is probably the most common problem most common disease problem we see on coneflower. Are any of you familiar with aster yellows? So it causes witch's broom, which is sort of a proliferation of buds. This is like a witch's broom right there. And the other thing that aster yellow causes is what's known as virescence, when tissue that would normally be colored is green. So these are not a green variety of coneflower. These would be purple coneflowers, but they are green because they have aster yellows. So we'll get people like somebody I work with at the City of Bloomington Utilities Department posted her green coneflowers in the middle of her purple patch the other day and like, what's going on? Well, you have aster yellows. So this is systemic and there is no treatment for this. So this is again a place where sanitation would probably be your best bet, just removing that infected plant. The way aster yellows is moved, it's another piercing sucking insect. So as they come and feed on different plants, there's potential to spread the disease around, you know, your whole patch could turn. I've never heard of anybody having a whole patch turn green, but lots of people have seen this in their garden. How many have any of you had green coneflowers? Nobody? Okay. You had a question.
Taking out the one would be enough.
One
Or do you wanna
plant.
go like
And because I would go ahead and take out the one plant. Yeah, yeah.
And you take out the plant, you just can't cut that off.
No, take out the whole plant root system and everything, as much of the root system as you can get without tearing everything up. Yep. This is aster yellows on marigold. It has, I don't know if you saw on the slide, but it has over 200 plant species that it can impact. So think the one that we really see it on is coneflower, though. It's pretty common on coneflower. It also, southern blight is another one. It's a fungus that has another wide range of host plants, favored by high heat and humidity. These are little, what are known as, they look like mustard seeds, but they're known as sclerotia. They're little hardened off parts of the fungus. And if you pull up the leaf, you may encounter those. Or you can also, and you'll hear more about this in your plant problem class, but you could always submit a sample to the Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab, which is a lab at Purdue that will take a look at plant samples and help you figure out what's going on. Another problem, I mentioned earlier that you know, most of the fungicides that are available to homeowners are preventatives. Some of the fungicides that are available to homeowners are also only available in, are only available in large quantities, and they're so expensive that they're cost prohibitive for the normal homeowner to buy. This was actually a lady in Brown County, and her whole yard was being impacted by this southern blight. And she looked into it, and like 2 gallons of fungicide, which would have been a lot and covered a lot of area, was going to cost her like $500. But she couldn't get it in a container any smaller either. So anyway, hard to get, just like the last slide. Terrachlor, a soil drench at planting will work, but hard to get on the garden scale bags. Already talked about that. Would you guys rather continue talking about problems, or would you like to spend the last 15 minutes talking about different plants for the garden? Plants, okay. I'll go back to where I was before then.
Well, before you get off that, how do you get into Japanese beetles?
Continue recording, continue.
So Japanese beetles have their preferred species for one thing. They, you know, like purple plum and basil and roses, and yes, things in the rose family in general are some of their favorites. Hand removal, people flicking them into like a mason jar full of soapy water can be effective. Neem oil, they are repelled by neem oil. Once they're adults, they're lots of insects are difficult to control as adults, and you don't see a lot of success with insecticides once they're adults. So talking about the different plants that are available to you, we do have a number of publications that will give you more information. I mentioned before that the HO means they're horticulture publications, so they have been written by specialists on campus. So you can check those out. If you have any trouble tracking anything down, just let Scott know or I know. We're happy to help you find them. Talking about hardy bulbs, things like daffodil, tulips. We also have a publication on forcing bulbs. If you like to force bulbs in the spring or late winter, have them in your house. Hardy bulbs have to be planted in the fall because they need to be exposed to a chilling period, a cold period in order to bloom. The most common problem with them is rot. If people put them in a place where the drainage isn't good, the bulbs will not be successful. There's all kinds of different sizes of bulbs out there, to itty bitty tiny to fist-sized bulbs. And just as a general guideline, you're planting them 2 to 3 times the depth of the size of the bulb. So if it's a tiny little bulb, it's not going very deep. If it's a big guy, it goes pretty deep. And this may seem obvious to folks who have gardened, but if you're gardening with children or gardening with brand new gardeners, making sure they know which end is down and which end is up leads to better chances of success. So with these guys, you'd want to fertilize as the new foliage emerges in the spring. That way they have the ability to actually utilize that fertilizer for the short time that they're photosynthesizing. When I was a kid, especially with the daffodils, my grandma would always have us braid them together, the leaves together, and then rubber band them together. And I've even seen that as recent, in the last few years. You don't want to do that. You want to leave the foliage open and exposed to as much sunlight as possible. And ideally, you would leave them there photosynthesizing until the foliage dies back naturally. If you, reach a point where you can't take it anymore, really 6 weeks is about the minimum. They need that 6 weeks of photosynthesis to put the energy back into the bulb to be able to produce a flower for the next year. And it's great if you can have a setup like this. Here, the daffodil foliage, it's interspersed with the stilbe. That's what this is. So as the daffodil foliage dies back, it's just going to sink down and the stilbe foliage is going to cover over it. So it's not like you have to look at it and say, can't stand looking at this anymore. Cut it down, pull it out. Anyway, if you're going to divide daffodils, you want to wait until that foliage is starting to die back because you want that 6 weeks or plus of photosynthesis time. And you, as we mentioned, you would divide them if you've had daffodils that have been blooming well and then you come upon a year or two where the bloom level seems to be reduced, that's when you want to divide. There's bulb iris out there as well. Siberian iris is probably the most common. They're grown in full sun, several different colors available and sizes available. My Siberian iris is about chest height. They've got little miniature Siberian iris. For all of these things, there's a catalog and or a group that, this is their thing. So if you're interested in a particular thing, the internet is a wonderful thing and you can find out lots more. Daffodils are great because deer don't like them. It's one of the few things that deer really have nothing to do with. They will leave them alone. And there's tons of daffodil or narcissus available out there. There is an Indiana Daffodil Society. They have a daffodil show every spring at Garfield Park, usually around the beginning of April. They do daffodil judging and all kinds of stuff. So if daffodils are your thing, like I said, there's a group for you. They're easy to grow. They're basically pest-free. The only thing you really need to do is make sure you don't plant them where they will rot and divide them if they stop blooming. Tulips, again, good drainage is important. Both deer and rabbits like tulips. So they can be more of a challenge to grow. There are lots of varieties out there, beautiful. Does anybody have any particular tulips that are their particular favorites? Or I can't grow them, the rabbits eat them. So, but if you don't deal with the mammals, they're relatively pest-free as well. So
So if you've planted daffodils and then you don't see them anymore, what's happened to them? Rotted?
that would be my first guess.
Even on a sandy hill?
If they didn't come up if you planted them last fall and they didn't come up,
Well, they came up one year, but then not the next.
I would suspect something happened to them. They rotted, and even on a sandy hill, you can have little areas that will hold water. Maybe they just ended up there. And if you happen to amend the soil when you planted them, that could be even more of a reason they might have. Or some mole or something came around and dislodged them. Critters in general aren't interested in them, but
Is there a way to get tulips to go past year 2 or 3 now?
I would say no. They sort of all poop out. They don't seem to retain their vigor, and yeah, so no, unless somebody here has a success story they can share. Yeah. So anemone,
Now, those come back every
yeah, bloom in the spring. Before you plant them, it's helpful to soak them in warm water. They naturalize well. Sounds like you've had good success with them. They have several different colors. Pretty nice flower. Grape hyacinth, this makes me think of my grandmother also. I don't know why. It naturalizes well also. The foliage can actually hang out in your lawn year-round. Has white or blue flowers. Again, these are all hardy bulbs, so you're planting these in the fall for next spring. There's all kinds of ornamental onions out there, all kinds of colors, shapes of the seed head, sizes of the seed head, and the bulbs go from pretty darn cheap to, oh my gosh, you want that much for a bulb? But if you can mass them early in the spring, they do have quite an impact. We were talking about making an impact earlier. And the seeds heads retain interest even after the bloom has faded. So, and they have basically, again, no pests, no insects, critters don't like them. So they're a nice addition for sure. This is the garlic chives that I have cursed multiple times this evening. And like I said, they have pretty white flowers. They just spread everywhere. But all kinds of variation of ornamental onions out there. So that's just a very small slice of hardy bulbs. That publication has more information. I'll go through the tender bulbs real quick, and then I'll just take a few minutes and see if you guys have any questions about any kind of plants that I can answer. So tender bulbs are plants that can't survive in Indiana in the winter. They're typically tropical plants that regrow here. You can either start them indoors or plant them outside once it's warm enough. In the fall, you need to dig them up and store them. Now, you'll always get people telling you, well, I haven't stored mine for 5 years and they keep growing. Well, maybe that's that microclimate that we talked about. But in general, you maybe get through one winter, but they're going to get nailed with an Indiana winter eventually. There's a publication on tender bulbs that talks more about how to store them. Some examples, caladium, these are used really frequently in containers. They do very well in containers. People also plant them in borders, varying sizes again. And they're easy to grow. They're relatively pest-free during the growing season. It's just that digging in the fall kind of thing that, and the bulbs again can be a little expensive. Cannas are a tropical plant. They come in lots of different bloom colors and foliage colors and sizes. You can get very short ones to ones that are taller than you are. They will also grow in water. So if you have like a fish pond in the backyard or something like that, these guys will grow in water. They really do add a lot to the landscape. I think I'm a big fan of cannas. They're really pretty, they're very striking. And again, you know, beyond the winter storage, they do very well here with few problems. Okay. So other tinder bulbs, gladiolas. You've probably all grown gladiolas from grandma. Dahlias. Gladiolas also are relatively pest-free during the growing season. Dahlias, Japanese beetles like dahlias. But dahlias, if you've never grown dahlias, you can get huge dinner plate size, gorgeous flowers. So they're definitely something to try. The tinder bulbs add a lot of big flowers to the options. Like I said, will send you this publication, so you're going to have this information, or Scott's going to forward it on to you, even though I haven't gone through everything. Does anybody have any questions about any particular plant that they've had trouble with, or that they've got a question about, or anything I talked about this evening? Or something you're interested in that I might direct you to resources?
Those three you mentioned, Greek windflower, grape hyacinth, and ornamental onion, are any of those invasive, or are those all pretty?
Yeah, none of the hardy bulbs you really have to worry about moving around. They might naturalize over a small area. You know, if you think about daffodils and like old home sites, they stay there and they may spread like within that very small area, but it's not like the bird picks up the seed and 5 miles down the road, you've got something going crazy like sweet autumn clematis. Yeah, so no. And when you see this I think I mentioned on most of the ones that are Indiana natives that they are Indiana natives. And like I said, that's sort of my thing. So if you have any questions about native plants and what might go where, I'm happy to help you guys with that. So I think it's like 8:57, so I think I'll wrap it up there, and I'll get a electronic copy of this to Scott so he can get it out to you. And then I had sent you a link that I don't think they printed that I want them to have too, which is from the Indiana Native Plant and Wildflower Society. But I'll resend that too. So, and if anybody wants attracting hummingbirds or kudzu, I'm farming those out. I hope you guys learned something. Hope you weren't bored to death. Yep.
I do have questions.
Sure.
To you. I don't know if they will even want to listen. But because I have problems with chemical drift in our yard,
Mm-hmm.
is there anything that is native to Indiana that won't harm whatever? Because I was thinking about burning bushes. But
Oh, to put up a kind of barrier.
2,4-D doesn't kill the burning bush. So I was thinking, is there anything else though that I could put up that's native that 2,4-D won't kill? Because that's really my only option.
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I will do a little looking and I don't know, because usually that's not.
Of course, Cynthia won't. It killed half my plants. So you need a barrier. I need a barrier.
I think pine
It's just
trees.
an acre. Well, I
Well-
need something that will come up next year.
Right.
I know. I get little pine trees, but
Yeah.
by the time they're big enough, I won't need, we may all be dead.
I think you should have a conversation with Scott about the drift to start with, and then I will do some looking, and I will actually ask some folks on campus to see if we can come up with a list that, I mean, I'm sure somebody's looked at that at some point, you would think,
She
so.
knows the farmer, and there's
And
some,
we've got to keep,
and there's,
even though it's a fragile friendship, we've got to keep it. 'Cause we're
Well,
smack dab
It's good to keep good neighbor relations, there is no doubt about that, so.
even though I
So you've already had a conversation about the
brought it up
drift.
to